There are more pyramids in Sudan than in Egypt. That sentence is so counterintuitive, so thoroughly at odds with everything the modern world believes about pyramids and about Africa, and about which civilizations built what, that most people who hear it for the first time assume it must be wrong. It is not wrong. The country of Sudan, in the northeastern corner of Africa, contains between 200 and 255 pyramids, depending on which structures are included in the count. Egypt contains roughly 130. The margin is not close. Sudan has nearly twice as many pyramids as Egypt, and almost no one in the world knows this. The pyramids of Sudan are not scattered across the landscape in isolated clusters, the way the Egyptian pyramids are distributed along the western edge of the Nile Valley from Abu Rawash to the Fayoum. The largest concentration of Sudanese pyramids is found at a single site, a stretch of desert ridge overlooking the eastern bank of the Nile in the ancient region of Meroe, roughly 200 kilometers north of the modern Sudanese capital of Khartoum. At Meroe, more than 200 pyramids rise from the sand in a dense, almost forest-like cluster that has no parallel anywhere else in the ancient world. They are not large by Egyptian standards. The tallest stands roughly 30 meters high, a fraction of the height of the Great Pyramid. They are steep, narrow structures, with sides rising at angles of roughly 70 degrees, far steeper than any Egyptian pyramid, giving them a distinctive spire-like profile that looks nothing like the broad, massive forms of Giza. They are built of sandstone rather than limestone, and their surfaces have been weathered by centuries of desert wind into rough, textured facades that range in color from deep ochre to pale gold, depending on the time of day and the angle of the light. They are, by any standard of visual impact, one of the most extraordinary archaeological landscapes on Earth. A visitor standing on the desert ridge at Meroe in the late afternoon, when the low sun throws long shadows across the sand and the sandstone surfaces glow with a warm amber radiance, is confronted with a sight that has no equivalent anywhere else in the world. A horizon filled with pyramids, dozens of them, rising from the sand in every direction, their steep profiles silhouetted against the desert sky, like the spines of some vast geological creature emerging from the earth. The experience is overwhelming, disorienting, and profoundly moving because it forces a confrontation with a simple fact that the modern world has been remarkably successful at ignoring. There was a great civilization here, a civilization that built pyramids by the hundreds, that ruled an empire that stretched from the confluence of the Niles to the borders of Egypt, and that has been almost completely erased from the popular understanding of world history, and they are almost completely unknown to the general public. The people who built these pyramids were the kings and queens of Kush, a civilization that flourished in what is now northern Sudan for more than 1,000 years, from roughly the 8th century BC to the 4th century AD. The Kushites were not Egyptians. They were a distinct African people with their own language, their own script, their own gods, their own artistic traditions, and their own political institutions. But they had a deep and complex relationship with Egypt that stretched back millennia, a relationship that was sometimes hostile, sometimes cooperative, and sometimes, for a remarkable period of roughly 75 years in the 8th and 7th centuries BC, one of outright political domination. During this period, Kushite kings conquered Egypt, ruled it as pharaohs, and founded what Egyptologists call the 25th Dynasty, a dynasty of black African rulers who governed the oldest civilization in the Mediterranean world and who were among the most powerful monarchs on earth. They are known to modern scholarship as the Black Pharaohs, a vivid and evocative designation that captures both their African identity and their assumption of the full ceremonial and theological apparatus of Egyptian kingship. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand who the Kushites were, how they conquered Egypt, and why, after they were driven from Egypt by the Assyrian Empire in the 7th century BC, they carried the pyramid tradition back to their homeland and continued building pyramids for more than 600 years after the last pyramid was built in Egypt. You are going to walk through the royal cemeteries of El Kuru, Nuri, and Meroe, and you are going to see the most extraordinary concentration of pyramids anywhere on the planet. You are going to meet the Italian treasure hunter, who decapitated dozens of these pyramids in the 1830s in search of gold, and the American archaeologist who spent decades recording what remained. And you are going to confront a question that the Nubian pyramids pose with devastating clarity. How does the modern world decide which civilizations are remembered and which are forgotten, which achievements are celebrated and which are erased, and what does it mean that the longest surviving pyramid tradition in human history has been almost entirely excluded from the story the world tells about the ancient past? Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now, let us begin. The civilization that built the Nubian pyramids did not emerge from nowhere. It grew out of a cultural tradition that was among the oldest in Africa, a tradition rooted in the Upper Nile Valley, in the region between the first and sixth cataracts of the Nile, in the land that the ancient Egyptians called Kush and that the Greeks and Romans called Nubia. The relationship between Egypt and Kush was one of the longest and most consequential in the history of the ancient world, stretching back more than 3,000 years before the Kushite conquest of Egypt and continuing for centuries after the Kushites were driven out. It was a relationship defined by trade, by warfare, by cultural exchange, by mutual suspicion, and, at its most intense, by the complete political absorption of one civilization into the other. The earliest major civilization in the Upper Nile Valley, predating the Kushite kingdom by more than a millennium, was Kerma, named after a site near the third cataract of the Nile in modern Sudan. Kerma flourished between roughly 2500 and 1500 BC, contemporaneous with Egypt's Old and Middle Kingdoms, and it produced a material culture of remarkable sophistication. The city of Kerma, excavated by the Swiss archaeologist Charles Bonnet beginning in the 1970s, was dominated by a massive mud brick structure called the Western Defufa, a temple or ceremonial building that rose to a height of roughly 18 meters, and that was among the largest mud brick structures in Africa. The Kerma culture produced distinctive pottery, a thin-walled, burnished black-topped redware that is among the finest ceramics of the ancient world, and that was produced without the use of the potter's wheel, relying instead on hand-building techniques of extraordinary precision and artistic sensitivity. The aesthetic quality of Kerma pottery has led ceramic specialists to rank it among the supreme achievements of ancient African craftsmanship, and its widespread distribution across the Upper Nile Valley and beyond testifies to the extent of Kerma's trade networks and cultural influence. The cemetery at Kerma contained royal tumuli, massive circular burial mounds that covered chambers filled with sacrificed retainers, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, a funerary practice that was unique in the Nile Valley and that testifies to the immense power, the religious authority, and the absolute control over human life and death that the Kerma rulers exercised over their subjects. The Kerma kingdom was eventually conquered by the new Kingdom Pharaohs of Egypt, who extended their military control over the Upper Nile Valley during the 18th Dynasty and administered the region through a colonial bureaucracy headed by a viceroy bearing the title King's Son of Kush. The Egyptian colonial period, lasting roughly 500 years, from the 15th to the 11th centuries BC, transformed Nubian culture in profound ways. Egyptian temples were built throughout the region, including the famous rock-cut temples of Abu Simbel, carved by Ramesses II into the cliff face above the Nile, as a demonstration of Egyptian power and divine authority. Egyptian artistic styles, religious practices, writing systems, and administrative techniques were adopted by the Nubian elite, creating a hybrid culture that combined deeply rooted indigenous African traditions with imported Egyptian forms and conventions. The Nubian god Amun, worshipped at the great temple of Jebel Barkal near the Fourth Cataract, became identified with the Egyptian Amun of Thebes, creating a theological link between the two regions that would have profound political consequences centuries later. When Egyptian control over Nubia collapsed during the political fragmentation of the Third Intermediate Period, roughly the 11th to the 8th centuries BC, The Nubian elite did not abandon the cultural forms they had adopted and internalized during the long centuries of Egyptian colonial domination. Instead, they preserved them, maintained them, and eventually used them as the basis for a new political entity that was Egyptian in its cultural expression but Nubian in its ethnic identity and political independence. The Kingdom of Kush, centered on the city of Napata near Jebel Barkal, emerged during this period as a powerful state that controlled the gold mines and the trade routes linking sub-Saharan Africa to the wider Mediterranean world and the agricultural resources of the Upper Nile Valley. The Kushite kings adopted the full ceremonial apparatus of Egyptian kingship: the double crown, the royal titulary, the cartouche, the uraeus cobra, the divine identification with Amun and Horus. They built temples in the Egyptian style. They inscribed their monuments in Egyptian hieroglyphs. They worshipped Egyptian gods alongside their own indigenous deities. And they did all of this not as imitators or provincials, but as self-conscious inheritors of a tradition that they considered their own. The moment when this inherited tradition was transformed from cultural aspiration into political reality came around 747 BC, when a Kushite king named Piye, also known in older scholarship as Pianki, launched a military campaign that conquered the entire Nile Valley from the Fourth Cataract to the Mediterranean Sea. Piye's conquest of Egypt is one of the most remarkable military achievements of the ancient world, and it is documented in extraordinary detail by Piye's own victory stela, a massive slab of grey granite that was erected at the Temple of Amun at Jebel Barkal, and that records the campaign in the first-person voice of the king himself. The stela, now in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, is one of the longest and most detailed royal inscriptions to survive from ancient Egypt, and it provides a vivid, sometimes startlingly personal account of the military operations that brought Egypt under Kushite control. Piye's account describes a campaign that began in response to the territorial ambitions of Tefnut, a Libyan-descended ruler of the Western Delta, who was attempting to extend his control over all of Lower Egypt. Piye's army marched north from Napata, defeating opposing forces in a series of engagements along the Nile and methodically besieging and capturing the major cities of Upper and Lower Egypt. The stela records Piye's actions with a narrative immediacy that makes the ancient text read almost like a modern campaign journal. When Piye reached the city of Hermopolis, whose ruler Namlot had rebelled against him, the stela describes how the king entered the enemy's stables and found that the horses had been starved during the siege. Piye was more angered by the mistreatment of the horses than by the political rebellion itself, a detail that gives the text a psychological specificity and an emotional immediacy that is almost unique in ancient Near Eastern royal inscriptions, and that transforms Piye from a distant, historical figure into a recognizable human personality. The conquest was complete. Piye received the submission of the Delta rulers, visited the Temple of Ra at Heliopolis, where he performed the ancient rituals of Egyptian kingship, and then returned to Napata, where he was buried in a pyramid at the royal cemetery of El Kuru. He never returned to Egypt. His successors, however, maintained and consolidated the Kushite grip on the Nile Valley. Shabaka, who succeeded Piye around 705 BC, moved the administrative center of the kingdom to Thebes and assumed the full regalia and titulary of an Egyptian pharaoh. Shebitku continued the process of consolidation, and Taharqa, who came to the throne around 690 BC and reigned for roughly 26 years, presided over the zenith of the Kushite Egyptian Empire, a political entity that stretched from the confluence of the Blue and White Niles to the shores of the Mediterranean, one of the largest empires in the world at that time, and arguably the largest and most powerful political unit that the African continent would produce until the modern era. Taharqa was one of the most energetic builders of the ancient world, and his building program was among the most ambitious undertaken by any ruler of the first millennium BC. He constructed or restored temples throughout Egypt and Nubia, from the great temple of Amun at Karnak, where he erected a massive columned kiosk in the first court that still stands today as one of the most imposing single structures at the site, to the temple at Jebel Barkal, where he carved elaborate rock-cut chambers into the sacred mountain and decorated them with scenes depicting his coronation, by the god Ammon. At Karnak, Taharqa's column, a single massive pillar standing roughly 21 meters tall in the first court of the temple, is one of the most recognizable landmarks in the Theban temple complex, and a permanent reminder of the period when a Kushite king ruled from the throne of the pharaohs. He also undertook construction projects at Memphis, at Thebes, and at numerous smaller sites throughout the Nile Valley, employing a workforce drawn from both Egyptian and Nubian populations and deploying resources that testified to the wealth and the administrative capacity of the Kushite Egyptian Empire at its zenith. His building program was deliberately designed to associate the Kushite dynasty with the greatest traditions of Egyptian architecture, to demonstrate that the Black Pharaohs were not foreign usurpers but legitimate heirs to the oldest and most revered cultural tradition in the Mediterranean world. The message was conveyed through the language of stone, through temples and colonnades and obelisks and relief carvings that spoke the visual vocabulary of Egyptian kingship, with a fluency that only a dynasty deeply immersed in that vocabulary could achieve. But the Kushite control of Egypt was not destined to last. In 671 BC, the Assyrian Empire, the most powerful military force in the ancient Near East, under its king Esarhaddon, invaded Egypt and defeated Taharqa's army in a series of devastating battles that demonstrated the overwhelming superiority of Assyrian military technology and tactical organization. The Assyrians deployed iron weapons, siege engines, and a professional infantry that the Kushite Egyptian forces, still relying on older Bronze Age military traditions, could not match in open battle. Taharqa retreated south, first to Thebes, then to Napata. The Assyrians pursued relentlessly. A second Assyrian invasion, under Esarhaddon's successor Ashurbanipal, one of the most ruthless and most culturally sophisticated of the Assyrian kings, penetrated deep into Upper Egypt, reaching the sacred city of Thebes and sacking it in 663 BC. The sack of Thebes was an event so shocking, so unprecedented in the memory of the ancient Near East, that it was remembered in the Hebrew Bible, in the Book of Nahum, as a measure of the ultimate vulnerability of even the greatest and most ancient cities. The Assyrians looted the temples, carried off the treasures that centuries of pharaohs had accumulated, and demonstrated with brutal finality that no city, however sacred, however ancient, however rich, was immune to the destructive power of a determined and technologically superior military force. Taharqa's successor, Tuntamani, made one final attempt to reclaim Egypt, briefly recapturing Memphis before being driven south again by the Assyrians. By 656 BC, the Kushite presence in Egypt was over, and the 25th dynasty had ended. But here is the detail that transforms this story from a narrative of political rise and fall into something far more consequential for the history of human civilization. When the Kushite kings retreated from Egypt, they did not abandon Egyptian culture. They took it with them. They carried the traditions, the rituals, the architectural forms, and the theological concepts of Egyptian kingship back to their Nubian homeland, and they continued to practice them for more than 600 years after they lost control of Egypt itself. And the most visible expression of this cultural continuity was the pyramid. The Kushite kings had begun building pyramids even before they conquered Egypt. At El Kuru, a site near the fourth cataract of the Nile, roughly 300 kilometers upstream from Khartoum, the earliest Kushite royal tombs were simple tumuli, circular mounds of earth and stone that followed the indigenous Nubian burial tradition. But during the 8th century BC, as the Kushite elite became increasingly engaged with Egyptian culture, the tumuli were replaced by small pyramids built of local sandstone and capped with a pyramidion, the pointed capstone that symbolized the Benben stone of Egyptian solar theology. The pyramids at El Kuru were modest in size, with base lengths of roughly 8 to 11 meters and estimated original heights of roughly 10 to 15 meters, but they followed the essential Egyptian model: a square base, sloping sides, a capstone at the summit, and a burial chamber cut into the bedrock beneath the pyramid. The transition from tumuli to pyramids at El Kuru is one of the most significant cultural transformations documented in the archaeology of the ancient Nile Valley. It marks the moment when the Kushite elite adopted the most iconic and most symbolically loaded form of Egyptian monumental architecture as their own funerary tradition. The adoption was not merely architectural, it was theological. The pyramid, in Egyptian thought, was a mechanism for the king's ascent to the sky, a solidified ray of sunlight that connected the earth to the heavens and that facilitated the dead king's transformation into an eternal being of light. By building pyramids, the Kushite kings were claiming not just the form but the meaning of the Egyptian pyramid, asserting their right to the same cosmic destiny that the Egyptian pharaohs had claimed for more than 2,000 years. Piye, the conqueror of Egypt, was buried in a pyramid at El Kuru, as were his successors Shabaka, Shebitku, and Tantamani. But the most ambitious Kushite pyramid builder was Taharqa, who chose a new site for his burial, a place called Nuri, roughly 10 kilometers from El Kuru on the opposite bank of the Nile. Taharqa's pyramid at Nuri was the largest Kushite pyramid ever built, with a base length of roughly 51 meters and an estimated original height of approximately 40 to 50 meters. It was built of dressed sandstone blocks, with a core of rubble and a smooth outer casing that has since been removed by weathering and stone robbing. The pyramid was accompanied by a mortuary chapel, a cemetery of subsidiary pyramids for queens and princes, and a processional way that connected the complex to the valley below. The scale was ambitious, far larger than any previous Kushite monument, and it reflected Taharqa's status as the most powerful and most self-consciously Egyptian of the Kushite kings. The American archaeologist George Andrew Reisner arrived at Nuri in 1916, and his excavation of the site over the following years was one of the landmark achievements of early 20th century Nile Valley archaeology. Reisner, who was affiliated with Harvard University and the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, was one of the most systematic and most productive excavators of his generation, a man whose standards of recording and publication set a benchmark that few of his contemporaries could match, and that many subsequent archaeologists have aspired to, but not always achieved. His excavation of the Nuri Cemetery documented more than 20 royal pyramids and dozens of subsidiary structures, producing a body of architectural, epigraphic, and material evidence that remains the foundation for all subsequent study of the Kushite royal burial tradition. Reisner's teams meticulously mapped each pyramid, recorded the dimensions of every chamber, catalogued every artifact recovered from the burial deposits, and produced plans and section drawings of extraordinary precision that allow modern scholars to study structures that have deteriorated significantly since the excavation took place. The burial chambers beneath the Nuri pyramids contain the remains of elaborate funerary equipment, including shabtis, the small servant figures that were placed in Egyptian and Kushite tombs to perform labor on behalf of the deceased in the afterlife. Taharqa's burial alone contained more than 1,000 shabtis, carved from stone and faience, each inscribed with the king's name and titles, a quantity that testifies to the wealth and the theological ambition of the most powerful of the Black Pharaohs. Reisner's work at Nuri was followed by his excavation of the royal cemetery at El Kuru, where he documented the earliest phase of the Kushite pyramid tradition and traced the transition from tumuli to pyramids that marks the cultural transformation of the 8th century BC. His publication of the El Kuru and Nuri results, completed after his death by his colleague Dowse Dunham, remains the standard scholarly reference for both sites and is still consulted by every researcher who works on Kushite royal architecture. Reisner was a meticulous recorder, but also a man of his time, and his interpretations of the Kushite material were shaped by the racial assumptions of early 20th century American scholarship, assumptions that led him to attribute the achievements of the Kushite civilization to Egyptian influence rather than to indigenous African creativity. Subsequent generations of scholars have challenged Reisner's interpretive framework while acknowledging the lasting value of his archaeological documentation. The pyramid tradition that Reisner documented at El Kuru and Nuri was continued and elaborated at the site of Meroe, roughly 250 kilometers south of Nuri, where the Kushite capital was relocated sometime during the 4th or 3rd century BC. The move to Meroe marked a shift in the center of gravity of the Kushite kingdom, away from the Egyptian frontier and toward the African interior, and it was accompanied by significant cultural changes, including the development of a new script, the Meroitic script, which replaced Egyptian hieroglyphs for most purposes, and which has been only partially deciphered despite more than a century of scholarly effort. The pyramids at Meroe, built over a period of roughly 600 years, from the 3rd century BC to the 4th century AD, represent the longest continuous pyramid building tradition anywhere in the world. They are smaller than the pyramids at Nuri and El Kuru, with base lengths typically in the range of 8 to 15 meters and heights in the range of 10 to 30 meters, but they are far more numerous, with more than 200 structures documented at the 3 main cemetery areas of the site. The sheer number of pyramids at Meroe is itself a statement about the nature of Kushite royal culture. In Egypt, pyramids were built exclusively for kings, and, in certain periods, for queens. In Kush, pyramids were built for a wider range of the royal and elite population, including not only kings and queens, but also princes, high officials, and members of the court. The democratization of the pyramid form, the extension of what had been an exclusively royal privilege to a broader segment of the elite, reflects a political culture that was, in some respect, more distributive and less absolutist than its Egyptian model. The pyramid at Meroe was not the exclusive prerogative of the king. It was the badge of elite status, the architectural mark of membership in the ruling class, and its proliferation across the cemetery reflects a society in which power and prestige were shared, at least symbolically, among a wider circle of the governing elite than was typical in Egypt. The modern history of the Nubian pyramids is, in its own way, as dramatic and as disturbing as their ancient history, because it includes a chapter of deliberate destruction that has few parallels in the annals of archaeology. In 1834, an Italian doctor and treasure hunter named Giuseppe Ferlini arrived at Meroe with a small team of workers and began systematically dismantling the pyramids in search of the gold and jewels that he believed were hidden inside them. Ferlini's method was simple and devastating. He started at the top of each pyramid and worked his way down, removing the capstone, then the upper courses, then progressively lower levels, until he reached the burial chamber, or until the labor of demolition exceeded his patience. He decapitated more than 40 pyramids at Meroe, destroying their upper portions and leaving them as truncated stumps that bear the scars of his work to this day. Ferlini did find treasure, at least once. In the pyramid of Queen Amenishaheto, a powerful Candace or Queen Mother, who ruled Meroe in the 1st century BC, Ferlini discovered a cache of gold jewelry of extraordinary quality, including bracelets, rings, necklaces, and shield rings, decorated with images of gods and goddesses in a distinctive Meroitic style that combined Egyptian, Hellenistic, and indigenous African artistic elements. The jewelry which Ferlini sold to European museums is now divided between the Egyptian Museum in Munich and the Egyptian Museum in Berlin, where it remains one of the finest collections of ancient African gold work in the world. But the price of this single discovery was the partial or complete destruction of dozens of pyramids whose archaeological value far exceeded the monetary value of any treasure they might have contained. The architectural evidence, the epigraphic data, the stratigraphic relationships, the construction details that the upper portions of the pyramids would have preserved, all of this was lost forever when Ferlini's workers pulled the stones from the summits and tossed them aside. The destruction inflicted by Ferlini is visible at Meroe today as a landscape of truncated pyramids, monuments whose profiles are cut off abruptly at varying heights, giving the cemetery a jagged, incomplete appearance that is a permanent record of one man's greed and another civilization's loss. The irony is that Ferlini's treasure hunting was motivated by the same assumption that has driven the looting of ancient sites throughout history. The assumption that the primary value of an ancient monument lies in the portable objects it contains, rather than in the architectural and historical information embedded in its fabric. The assumption is wrong, as it has always been wrong, but its consequences are irreversible. The jewelry in Munich and Berlin is beautiful. The pyramids it was extracted from are damaged beyond repair. The Candaces of Meroe, the powerful queen mothers, whose pyramids were among the largest and most elaborately decorated in the Meroitic cemetery, deserve particular attention because they represent a dimension of the Kushite political system that has no direct parallel in Egyptian governance. The title Candace, derived from the Meroitic word Kod or Kandak, designated the queen mother who held a position of formal political authority in the Meroitic state that went far beyond the ceremonial role typically assigned to royal women in the ancient Near East. Several Candaces ruled Meroe in their own right, without a reigning king exercising the full executive, military, and religious authority of the monarch. The Candace Amanirenas, who ruled in the late 1st century BC, led the Meroitic army in a war against the Roman Empire, attacking the Roman garrison at Syene, modern Aswan, and carrying off a bronze head of the Emperor Augustus as a trophy, which she buried beneath the threshold of a temple at Meroe, so that every person entering the temple would walk over the Roman emperor's face. The bronze head, discovered by the British archaeologist John Garstang in 1910, is now in the British Museum, where it remains one of the most vivid and most symbolically charged artifacts from the ancient Nile Valley. The role of the Candaces in Meroitic political life is one of the features that distinguishes the Kushite civilization most clearly from its Egyptian model. While Egypt had produced powerful queens, including Hatshepsut, Nefertiti, and Cleopatra, the institutionalization of female political authority in the office of the Candace was a distinctly Meroitic innovation, a development that reflected the indigenous African political traditions of the region rather than the patriarchal norms of Egyptian kingship. The pyramids of the Candaces at Meroe are among the largest and most prominent in the cemetery, their scale and their decorative programs reflecting the political power and the religious significance of the women they were built to commemorate. The archaeological exploration of Meroe has continued into the 21st century, with major campaigns conducted by the German Archaeological Institute, the University of Khartoum, the Qatar Sudan Archaeological Project, and other international teams. These campaigns have produced new evidence for the chronology, the architecture, and the cultural context of the Meroitic pyramid tradition, including the discovery of previously unknown pyramids, the re-examination of structures that were damaged by Ferlini, and the application of modern conservation techniques to stabilize monuments that are threatened by erosion, flooding, and the encroachment of wind-blown sand. The work is ongoing, and new discoveries are reported regularly, but the fundamental picture has not changed since Reisner's day. The Nubian pyramids represent the longest surviving and most prolific pyramid-building tradition in the world, a tradition that began in the 8th century BC and continued without interruption until the 4th century AD, spanning more than 1,100 years and producing more pyramids than Egypt ever built across its entire history. And it is this tradition, this extraordinary 1,000-year commitment to a single architectural form, that makes the story of the Nubian pyramids so significant and so profoundly disturbing, because the tradition that Kushites preserved was the tradition that Egypt abandoned. The form that the Kushites maintained was the form that the Egyptians themselves had ceased to build centuries before the first Kushite pyramid was raised. The Nubian pyramids are not merely a continuation of the Egyptian tradition. They are its afterlife, the survival of a cultural practice in a new homeland after it had died in its place of origin. And the question of why the tradition survived in Nubia when it died in Egypt is one of the most fascinating and most poorly understood questions in the archaeology of the ancient Nile Valley. The core problem of the Nubian pyramids is a problem of cultural transmission, and it begins with a paradox that has no easy resolution. The pyramid tradition in Egypt ended roughly 700 years before the Kushite kings began building pyramids at El Kuru. The last Egyptian royal pyramids were small, structurally compromised monuments built during the 13th dynasty, around 1700 BC. The first Kushite pyramids at El Kuru date to the 8th century BC, roughly 900 years later. Between these two dates, no pyramids were built anywhere in the Nile Valley. The tradition was dead, the skills had been lost. The theological framework that had sustained the tradition for more than 1,000 years had been replaced by new funerary practices, rock-cut tombs in the Valley of the Kings, temple burials, and other forms that served the same theological purposes without the enormous expense of pyramid construction. When the Kushite kings began building pyramids in the 8th century BC, they were not continuing a living tradition, they were reviving a dead one. The question of why the Kushites chose to revive the pyramid tradition, rather than adopting the more current funerary practices of the New Kingdom and Third Intermediate Period, is one of the most debated questions in Kushite studies. The simplest explanation is that the Kushites, as inheritors of the Egyptian cultural tradition through centuries of colonial contact, looked back to the Old and Middle Kingdoms as the golden age of Egyptian civilization, the period when Egypt was most powerful, most culturally productive, and most closely identified with the monumental forms that defined Egyptian identity. The pyramid was the supreme symbol of that golden age, the architectural form most closely associated with the divine power of the pharaoh, and with the cosmic order that the pharaoh was responsible for maintaining. By building pyramids, the Kushite kings were aligning themselves not with contemporary Egypt, which was fragmented, weakened, and ruled by Libyan-descended dynasties that the Kushites may have regarded as illegitimate, but with the Egypt of the pyramid builders, the Egypt of Khufu and Khafre and Senusret and Amenemhat, the Egypt that represented the highest expression of the Nile Valley civilization that the Kushites considered themselves part of. But this explanation, while plausible, raises as many questions as it answers. How did the Kushites know how to build pyramids? The construction techniques had not been practiced for centuries. The workforce that had built the Egyptian pyramids had dispersed. The architectural knowledge that had been accumulated over generations of practice had been lost through the same process of skill atrophy that has consumed specialized knowledge in every civilization that has ceased to practice a particular craft. The Kushite builders could see the Egyptian pyramids. They could walk around them. They could measure them. But seeing a finished monument and knowing how to build one are very different things, and the gap between observation and execution is the gap that the Kushite builders had to bridge. The answer, or at least the partial answer that the archaeological evidence provides, is that the Kushites did not attempt to replicate the Egyptian pyramids. They adapted them. The Nubian pyramids are fundamentally different from their Egyptian predecessors in several crucial respects. They are much smaller. The largest Kushite pyramid, Taharqa's monument at Nuri, had a base length of roughly 51 meters, less than a quarter of the Great Pyramid's base length. The typical Meroitic pyramid had a base length of 8 to 15 meters, a fraction of even the smallest Egyptian royal pyramids. The reduced scale was not a concession to weakness or a sign of limited resources. It was an adaptation to a different set of priorities. The Kushites did not need or want pyramids of Egyptian scale. They needed pyramids that could be built quickly, within the limited time frame available between a king's accession and his death, and that could be multiplied across a cemetery containing the burials of dozens of elite individuals, rather than concentrated in a single overwhelming monument for a single monarch. The proliferation of smaller pyramids at Meroe is not a sign of diminished ambition. It is evidence of a different kind of ambition, an ambition that valued breadth of monumental display across the ruling class rather than concentration in the person of a single sovereign. They are much steeper. Egyptian pyramids were built at angles ranging from roughly 43 to 54 degrees. Kushite pyramids were built at angles of roughly 65 to 70 degrees, producing a tall, narrow, spire-like profile that is visually distinctive and structurally very different from the broad, massive Egyptian form, and they are constructed differently. The cores of the Kushite pyramids are solid sandstone in the smaller structures and rubble fill in the larger ones, cased with dressed sandstone blocks that give the surface a smooth but textured appearance, quite unlike the polished limestone of the Egyptian casings. These differences are not mistakes. They are adaptations, deliberate modifications of the Egyptian form to suit the resources, the skills, the aesthetic preferences, and the theological requirements of Kushite culture. The steep angle, in particular, appears to be a conscious choice rather than a structural compromise. A 70-degree angle produces a pyramid that is taller relative to its base width than a 50-degree Egyptian pyramid, creating a more dramatic vertical profile that emphasizes height over mass. The steep Kushite pyramids look as though they are reaching for the sky, straining upward with an urgency that the more settled, more massive Egyptian pyramids do not possess. The visual effect is one of aspiration rather than permanence, of movement rather than stability, of a culture that is reaching toward a tradition it admires rather than resting comfortably within it. And it gets stranger. The Kushite adaptation of the pyramid form was accompanied by a broader process of cultural transformation that produced a civilization that was neither Egyptian nor purely indigenous African, but something genuinely new, a synthesis that drew on both traditions while being reducible to neither. The most dramatic evidence of this synthesis is the Meroitic script, which was developed sometime during the 3rd or 2nd century BC, and which replaced Egyptian hieroglyphs as the primary writing system of the Kushite kingdom. The Meroitic script uses symbols that are derived from Egyptian hieroglyphs and Egyptian Demotic script, but it writes a language that is not Egyptian, a language that belongs to no known language family, and that has been only partially deciphered, despite more than a century of scholarly effort. The partial decipherment of Meroitic is one of the most tantalizing and most deeply frustrating situations in the entire field of ancient Near Eastern and African studies, a puzzle that has resisted solution despite the efforts of some of the finest linguists and philologists of the past century. The phonetic values of most Meroitic signs were determined in 1911 by the British Egyptologist Francis Llewellyn Griffith, who used bilingual inscriptions, texts written in both Meroitic and Egyptian, to establish the sound values of the Meroitic alphabet. Griffith's decipherment was a major achievement, comparable in its significance to Jean-François Champollion's decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphs a century earlier. But knowing how to pronounce a text is not the same as knowing what it means, and the Meroitic language itself remains largely unknown. The vocabulary, the grammar, the syntax, and the semantic range of the language are understood only in the broadest terms, with a handful of words and phrases whose meanings have been established through context and through comparison with related languages in the Nilo-Saharan language family, to which Meroitic may belong. The vast majority of Meroitic texts remain untranslated, their meanings locked behind a linguistic barrier that has resisted the efforts of scholars for more than a century. The implications of this linguistic barrier for our understanding of the Nubian pyramids are profound. The chapels attached to the Meroitic pyramids at Meroe and other sites are decorated with relief carvings that depict scenes from the funerary rituals of the Kushite kings and queens. Scenes that show the deceased being presented to the gods, receiving offerings, and undergoing the rituals of transformation that were believed to prepare the dead for eternal life. These scenes are accompanied by inscriptions in the Meroitic script that presumably identify the individuals depicted, describe the rituals being performed, and provide the theological commentary that would allow us to understand the meaning and the purpose of the funerary program in its entirety. But we cannot read the inscriptions. We can pronounce them. We cannot understand them. And as long as the Meroitic language remains undeciphered, our understanding of the Nubian pyramid tradition will remain fundamentally incomplete, a picture with captions that we can mouth but not comprehend. But here is the problem. The undeciphered Meroitic script is not merely a technical obstacle to scholarly understanding. It is a metaphor for the broader erasure that the Kushite civilization has suffered in the modern world. A civilization whose language cannot be read is a civilization whose voice has been silenced. A civilization that cannot speak for itself, that cannot tell its own story, that must rely on the descriptions of outsiders, of Egyptians, of Greeks, of Romans, of modern Western scholars to represent its experience to the world. The Egyptian voice is loud and clear, preserved in tens of thousands of inscriptions in a language that has been read fluently since Champollion's decipherment in 1822. The Kushite voice is muffled, indistinct, barely audible above the noise of the civilizations that surrounded it, preserved in inscriptions that we can see but not understand, that we can pronounce phonetically but not translate semantically, that tantalize with the promise of knowledge they cannot yet deliver, and that may never deliver it if the linguistic key to the Meroitic language is not eventually found. The Meroitic script is the most visible symbol of the Kushite civilization's silencing, the most concrete and most poignant evidence of a voice that was speaking for centuries, speaking eloquently and speaking urgently about matters of the deepest importance to the people who wrote it, and that has been reduced, by the accident of linguistic isolation, to a murmur that modern scholarship can detect but cannot interpret, can hear but cannot understand, can recognize as speech but cannot translate into meaning. The chapels attached to the Meroitic pyramids at Meroe provide the most extensive body of Meroitic visual evidence available for study, and their relief programs offer a window, however narrow and however opaque, into the funerary beliefs and the ritual practices of the Kushite elite. The typical Meroitic pyramid chapel was a small, single-room structure built against the eastern face of the pyramid, its walls decorated with carved and painted reliefs, depicting the deceased in the presence of the gods. The iconographic program draws heavily on Egyptian funerary art, with scenes of the deceased being purified by the gods, receiving the crown of justification, and ascending to the sky in a solar bark. But the program also includes elements that have no Egyptian parallel, including images of deities that are unique to the Meroitic pantheon, ritual gestures that do not appear in Egyptian art, and compositional arrangements that follow conventions different from those of the Egyptian tradition. The chapels are, in visual terms, the clearest evidence of the cultural synthesis that the Kushite civilization represents, a synthesis in which Egyptian forms were adopted, adapted, and combined with indigenous African elements to produce something that was neither Egyptian nor African in any simple sense, but something genuinely new. The destruction of many of these chapels, by Fellini and by subsequent treasure hunters and natural erosion, has reduced the available evidence to a fraction of what once existed, and the fragments that survive are often difficult to interpret in the absence of the architectural context that would have given them meaning. But even in their fragmentary state, the chapel reliefs demonstrate that the Kushite pyramid tradition was not a mere copy of the Egyptian tradition. It was a transformation, a creative reimagining of Egyptian forms in the light of Kushite cultural values, theological beliefs, and political requirements. The Kushites did not imitate Egypt. They inherited Egypt, transformed what they inherited, and produced something that was both a continuation of and a departure from the tradition they revered. Something is wrong with our assumptions about how cultural traditions are transmitted and preserved across civilizations. The conventional model of cultural transmission assumes that traditions flow from center to periphery, from the originating culture to the receiving culture, and that the receiving culture preserves a degraded or simplified version of the original tradition, a copy that is inevitably inferior to the model it was based on. The Nubian pyramids challenge this assumption in a way that is deeply uncomfortable for anyone who holds it. The Kushite pyramid tradition was not a degraded copy of the Egyptian tradition. It was a transformation, a creative adaptation that preserved the essential theological meaning of the pyramid form, while modifying its physical expression to suit a different cultural context. The steep, narrow Kushite pyramids are not failed attempts to build broad, massive Egyptian pyramids. They are a different kind of pyramid, designed according to different aesthetic principles, built with different materials and techniques, and embedded in a different cultural and theological framework. The relationship between the Egyptian and Kushite pyramids is not the relationship between an original and a copy. It is the relationship between a parent and a child, between an influence and a response, between a tradition and its evolution. The scholarly debate about the nature of Kushite cultural identity has been shaped, and in many ways distorted, by the colonial and racial assumptions that dominated Western scholarship during the period when the Nubian pyramids were first seriously studied. Reisner, whose archaeological work at El Kuru and Nuri remains fundamental to the field, interpreted the Kushite civilization as essentially derivative, a provincial imitation of Egyptian culture that lacked the creativity and the originality of its model. This interpretation, which was consistent with the racial hierarchies that structured early 20th century academic thought and that pervaded virtually every domain of Western intellectual life during the period when the foundations of Kushite studies were being laid, has been progressively challenged and largely abandoned by subsequent generations of scholars who have emphasized the indigenous African dimensions of Kushite culture and who have recognized the creative agency of the Kushite elite in their sophisticated adoption and transformation of Egyptian cultural forms. The reassessment of Kushite civilization is one of the most important and most consequential developments in Nile Valley archaeology over the past half-century, and it has been driven by a combination of new archaeological evidence, new theoretical frameworks, and a growing recognition within the scholarly community that the racial assumptions of earlier generations produced interpretations that were not merely incomplete, but actively misleading. The Kushites were not passive recipients of a superior culture. They were active agents who chose, from a range of available cultural models, the elements that served their own purposes, and who combined those elements with their own indigenous traditions to produce a civilization of genuine originality and genuine achievement. The British archaeologist and Meroiticist Derek Welsby, whose work on the archaeology of the Middle Nile Valley has been influential in reshaping the scholarly understanding of the Kushite civilization, has argued that the Kushite adoption of Egyptian cultural forms was not a passive reception, but an active appropriation, a deliberate choice made by the Kushite elite to adopt specific elements of Egyptian culture that served their political and theological purposes while rejecting or modifying elements that did not. The Kushites adopted the pyramid. They did not adopt the rock-cut tomb. They adopted the worship of Amun. They maintained their own indigenous deities alongside him. They adopted the Egyptian hieroglyphic script. They eventually replaced it with their own Meroitic script. The pattern is not one of wholesale borrowing, but of selective appropriation, a process in which the Kushites functioned as active agents rather than passive recipients, choosing what to take, what to modify, and what to leave behind. But here is what makes this truly terrifying, not in the conventional sense of physical danger, but in the deeper sense of a truth that unsettles fundamental assumptions. The Kushite pyramid tradition lasted longer than the Egyptian pyramid tradition. The Egyptians built pyramids for roughly 1,000 years, from Djoser's Step Pyramid around 2630 BC to the last 13th Dynasty pyramids around 1700 BC. The Kushites built pyramids for roughly 1,000 years as well, from the first pyramids at El Kuru in the 8th century BC to the last pyramids at Meroe in the 4th century AD. The two traditions are of comparable duration. They produced comparable numbers of monuments, and the Kushite tradition continued for more than 6 centuries after the Egyptian tradition had ended, maintaining a practice that its originators had abandoned, preserving a form that its inventors had discarded, keeping alive a tradition that the civilization that created it had allowed to die. The implications of this temporal comparison are profound. The Kushite pyramid tradition is not a footnote to the Egyptian tradition. It is its equal in duration and its superior in persistence. The Kushites maintained the pyramid form for 600 years after the Egyptians stopped building them. They were more faithful to the tradition than its originators. They preserved what Egypt abandoned, and the fact that this extraordinary continuity has been almost entirely ignored by popular culture, that the Nubian pyramids are virtually unknown, while the Egyptian pyramids are among the most famous structures on Earth, tells us something deeply disturbing about the mechanisms through which the modern world constructs its narrative of the ancient past. The erasure of the Nubian pyramids from popular consciousness is not an accident. It is the product of specific historical processes that have operated over centuries to marginalize African civilizational achievements and to concentrate the narrative of ancient accomplishment in the Mediterranean and the Near East. The European explorers, scholars, and colonial administrators who shaped the modern understanding of the ancient world in the 19th and early 20th centuries operated within a racial framework that made it difficult, in some cases psychologically impossible, for them to acknowledge that Black African peoples had produced civilizations of genuine sophistication and genuine originality. The Nubian pyramids were not merely overlooked. They were actively diminished, reinterpreted as provincial imitations of Egyptian originals, dismissed as crude copies that lacked the scale and the quality of their models, and relegated to the margins of a historical narrative that placed Egypt at the center and Africa at the periphery. The physical monuments survived. The scholarly framework ensured that they were not seen. This erasure has been partially corrected by the work of subsequent generations of scholars, including the Sudanese archaeologists who have conducted excavations at Kushite sites since Sudan's independence in 1956, and the international teams that have brought modern techniques and more equitable interpretive frameworks to the study of the Nubian past. The work of the Sudanese archaeologist Salah el-Din Ahmed, the German Meroiticist Fritz Hintze, the American archaeologist Timothy Kendall, and many others has transformed the scholarly understanding of the Kushite civilization, and has established beyond reasonable doubt that the Kushites were not imitators but innovators, not provincials but empire builders, not recipients of culture but creators of it. But the popular narrative has been slower to change. The Nubian pyramids remain largely unknown to the general public. The guidebooks are thin, the documentaries are few. The image of the pyramid in the popular imagination remains exclusively Egyptian, a white limestone monument rising from the desert sand near Cairo, rather than a sandstone spire rising from the desert sand near Khartoum. The silence that surrounds the Nubian pyramids is not the silence of a place that has nothing to say. It is the silence of a place that has been prevented from speaking, a place whose voice has been muffled by centuries of scholarly neglect, colonial dismissal, and racial prejudice, and that is only now, slowly and incompletely, beginning to be heard. The pyramids at Meroe do not need amplification, they need only attention. They stand in the desert, more than 200 of them, the largest concentration of pyramids anywhere on Earth, and they tell a story that the modern world has been remarkably successful at ignoring. The story of a great African civilization that built more pyramids than Egypt, that maintained the pyramid tradition longer than Egypt, and that has been almost entirely excluded from the narrative of human achievement that the modern world tells itself about the ancient past. The pattern of a peripheral culture preserving a tradition that the originating culture has abandoned is not unique to the Nubian pyramids. It occurs repeatedly in the history of human civilization, and each occurrence illuminates the same underlying dynamic, that cultural traditions are not permanent possessions of the civilizations that create them, but shared inheritances that can be adopted, adapted, and sustained by any culture that finds them meaningful. The Byzantine Empire provides one of the most instructive parallels. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century AD, the Eastern Roman Empire, centered on Constantinople, preserved the political institutions, the legal traditions, the literary culture, and the religious practices of Rome for nearly 1,000 additional years. The Byzantines spoke Greek rather than Latin. They worshipped in Orthodox rather than Catholic churches. They governed through a political system that was, in many respects, fundamentally different from the Roman Republic and the early Roman Empire. But they called themselves Romans. They considered themselves the legitimate heirs of the Roman tradition, and they maintained Roman cultural forms, including Roman law, Roman administrative practices, and Roman imperial ceremonial, for centuries after the city of Rome itself had ceased to be the center of the tradition it had created. The Byzantines were to Rome what the Kushites were to Egypt, peripheral inheritors, who maintained a tradition that the originating culture had abandoned, who were more faithful to the tradition than its originators, and who produced a civilization that was simultaneously a continuation of and a departure from the tradition it preserved. The Japanese adoption of Chinese cultural forms provides another parallel that reinforces the pattern from a completely independent cultural context. During the Nara and Heian periods, roughly the 8th to the 12th centuries AD, the Japanese elite adopted an enormous range of Chinese cultural practices, including Chinese writing, Chinese Buddhism, Chinese architectural styles, Chinese court ceremonial, and Chinese administrative techniques. Many of these practices were subsequently transformed by Japanese culture into forms that were recognizably different from their Chinese originals, forms that reflected the distinctive aesthetic sensibilities, the political structures, and the philosophical preoccupations of Japanese civilization. The Japanese tea ceremony, for example, has its origins in Chinese tea culture, but has evolved into something that is unmistakably Japanese, a ritual form that bears only a distant resemblance to its Chinese ancestor. In several cases, the Japanese preserved Chinese cultural practices that China itself subsequently abandoned or transformed, maintaining traditions that were, by the time of their preservation, more Chinese than anything that existed in China. The pattern is consistent across these diverse examples. A peripheral culture encounters a dominant cultural tradition. It adopts specific elements of that tradition, selecting the elements that serve its purposes, and rejecting those that do not. It transforms what it adopts, adapting the borrowed forms to its own cultural context, and producing something that is recognizably related to the original but genuinely different. And in some cases, it preserves the borrowed forms longer and more faithfully than the originating culture, maintaining traditions that the originators have abandoned and producing a cultural continuity that extends beyond the boundaries of the originating civilization. The Nubian pyramids are the most physically dramatic example of this pattern in the ancient world. They are the largest, the most numerous, and the most enduring monuments ever produced by a peripheral culture's adoption of a dominant cultural form. They stand in the Sudanese desert as permanent evidence that cultural traditions do not belong to the civilizations that create them, that they can be adopted and transformed and sustained by cultures that the originators might not have recognized as legitimate heirs, and that the most faithful custodians of a tradition are not always the people who invented it, but sometimes the people who loved it enough to carry it with them when the people who invented it had moved on. But here is the problem: the very quality that makes the Nubian pyramids so important, their status as the product of a cultural transmission from Egypt to Kush, has been used by generations of scholars to diminish them, to treat them as derivatives rather than as originals, as copies rather than as creations, as evidence of Kushite dependence on Egyptian culture rather than as evidence of Kushite creativity in adapting and transforming Egyptian culture. The distinction between derivative and transformative is crucial, and the Nubian pyramids stand on the transformative side of that distinction with a clarity that should be impossible to deny. A derivative copies, a transformation creates, the Kushites created. They created a new kind of pyramid, a new architectural language, a new synthesis of African and Egyptian traditions, a new civilization that lasted for more than 1,000 years, and that left behind more pyramids than the civilization it admired. That is not derivation, that is achievement. The end of the Nubian pyramid tradition, which came sometime in the 4th century AD, is itself a mystery that has never been fully resolved. The Meroitic kingdom declined during the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, weakened by economic changes, environmental pressures, and military threats from the emerging kingdom of Aksum to the southeast, in what is now Ethiopia and Eritrea. The last pyramids at Meroe were built during this period of decline, and their reduced size and simplified construction suggest that the resources available for monumental building had contracted significantly from the peak of the Meroitic period, when the last pyramid was sealed and the last burial was placed in its underground chamber. The pyramid tradition that had been maintained in the Nile Valley for more than 3,000 years, first in Egypt and then in Nubia, came to its final end. No more pyramids would be built anywhere in the Nile Valley. The form that Djoser had invented at Saqqara, that Sneferu had perfected at Dashur, that Khufu had magnified at Giza, and that the Kushite kings had carried south and maintained for a millennium, was finished. The silence that followed the end of the Meroitic pyramid tradition is the kind of silence that fills a space where something vast has come to rest. It is not the silence of a place that was never alive. It is the silence of a place that was alive for centuries, and that has now stopped. The silence of a heart that has ceased to beat, of a tradition that has exhausted the conditions that sustained it. The pyramids at Meroe stand in that silence today, 200 of them, more or less, clustered on a desert ridge in northern Sudan, their truncated summits bearing the scars of Fellini's treasure hunting, their sandstone surfaces weathered by 1,500 years of desert wind, their chapel walls still decorated with the barely legible reliefs of kings and queens and gods, whose names we can pronounce, but whose words we cannot understand. The core problem of the Nubian pyramids is not a problem of archaeology. The sites have been surveyed, the monuments have been measured, the burials have been excavated, the artifacts have been catalogued. The scholarly literature is extensive and grows more comprehensive with each passing decade. The core problem is a problem of recognition, of acknowledgement, of the willingness to see what is there and to accord it the significance it deserves. The Nubian pyramids are not hidden, they are not buried, they are not lost. They stand in plain sight, visible to anyone who makes the journey to Meroe or who opens a book on Kushite archaeology. They are ignored, not because they cannot be seen, but because the frameworks through which the modern world organizes its understanding of the ancient past have made them, in a fundamental sense, invisible. And that invisibility, that systematic failure of recognition that has persisted for more than a century, despite the accumulating evidence of Kushite civilizational achievement, is the core problem that the Nubian pyramids pose. It is not a problem that archaeology can solve. It is a problem that requires something more difficult than excavation, something more demanding than measurement, something more challenging than decipherment. It requires the willingness to revise the story, to expand the narrative, to make room in the popular understanding of the ancient world for a civilization that does not fit the existing categories, that complicates the existing hierarchies, and that challenges the existing assumptions about which peoples built great things and which peoples did not. The pyramids at Meroe have been waiting for this revision for more than 1,000 years. They have been waiting since the last Meroitic king was buried beneath his sandstone pyramid, and the tradition that had sustained the pyramid form for a millennium in Nubia came to its quiet, undocumented end. They can wait longer. The sandstone is patient. The desert is patient. The dead are patient. But the question is whether we can afford to make them wait, whether the cost of continuing to ignore the most prolific pyramid-building civilization in human history is a cost that our understanding of the past and of ourselves and of the full scope and the full diversity of human civilizational achievement can sustain indefinitely without suffering a diminishment that is as real and as consequential as the diminishment that the Kushite civilization itself has suffered through centuries of scholarly neglect and popular indifference. The royal cemetery of El Kuru, where the Kushite pyramid tradition began, is a place of austere beauty and archaeological significance that rewards the visitor who is willing to make the difficult journey to reach it. The site lies near the modern village of El Kuru, on the right bank of the Nile south of the Fourth Cataract, in a landscape of rocky desert hills and narrow cultivated strips that has changed remarkably little since the Kushite kings chose it as their burial ground more than 27 centuries ago. The pyramids at El Kuru are small by any standard, their bases rarely exceeding 11 meters on a side, and most have been reduced by erosion and stone robbing to low mounds of rubble that are barely recognizable as pyramidal structures. But beneath them, cut into the bedrock of the desert plateau, are burial chambers that have survived in far better condition than the superstructures above. Reisner's excavation of the El Kuru burial chambers in the 1918 and 1909 seasons revealed a sequence of royal tombs that documents the evolution of Kushite funerary architecture from simple pit graves to elaborate multi-chambered subterranean complexes decorated with painted scenes drawn from the Egyptian funerary repertoire. The earliest tombs at El Kuru are simple oval pits covered by tumuli, the circular earthen mounds that characterize the indigenous Nubian burial tradition. Over the course of several generations, these tumuli were replaced by increasingly elaborate structures that show progressively stronger Egyptian influence. First mastaba-like rectangular superstructures, then small pyramids with attached chapels, then more substantial pyramids with decorated burial chambers accessed by staircases cut into the rock. The sequence is a visual record of cultural transformation, a layer cake of changing traditions that documents, tomb by tomb and generation by generation, the process by which the Kushite elite adopted and internalized Egyptian funerary practices. The burial chamber of Tanutamani, the last Kushite king to rule Egypt, is one of the finest examples of painted tomb decoration from the Napatan period, and one of the most important examples of funerary art to survive from the first millennium BC anywhere in the Nile Valley. The walls of the chamber are covered with scenes from the Egyptian Book of the Dead and other funerary texts, painted in vivid colours, reds and blues and yellows and greens and blacks, that have survived remarkably well in the dry, sealed, lightless environment of the underground chamber. The artistic quality is uniformly high, executed by painters who possessed both the technical skill to render complex scenes with precision and the theological knowledge to compose a funerary program that was doctrinally correct according to Egyptian standards. The scenes depict the deceased king in the presence of Osiris, Isis, Nephthys, and other Egyptian funerary deities, performing the rituals of justification that were believed to prepare the dead for eternal life in the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise. The fact that this thoroughly Egyptian funerary program was created for a Kushite king in a cemetery in the Sudanese desert, more than 1,000 kilometers south of the Valley of the Kings at Thebes, is a measure of how completely and how deeply the Kushite elite had internalized the Egyptian funerary tradition by the late 7th century BC. The royal cemetery at Nuri, where Taharqa and his successors built their pyramids, presents a different set of challenges and a different set of revelations. The site is located on the left bank of the Nile, opposite El Kuru, on a low desert plateau that slopes gently toward the river. The pyramids at Nuri are larger than those at El Kuru, reflecting the increased wealth and ambition of the Napatan kingdom after the conquest of Egypt, and they are arranged in a roughly north-south line along the edge of the plateau, their profiles still visible against the desert sky, despite centuries of erosion and stone robbing. But the most remarkable feature of the Nuri cemetery is not visible from the surface. It lies underground, in the flooded burial chambers beneath the pyramids, chambers that have been submerged in groundwater for centuries, and that present one of the most technically demanding excavation challenges in Nile Valley archaeology. The flooding of the Nuri burial chambers was first documented by Reisner, who found that the chambers were filled with water to a depth of several meters, making conventional excavation impossible. Reisner's team pumped out the water from several chambers, recovered the artifacts that the ancient tomb robbers had left behind, and recorded the architectural details of the subterranean complexes before the water returned. But the pumping was a temporary solution. The water table in the Nuri area has risen significantly since antiquity, probably due to changes in the course of the Nile and the construction of modern irrigation infrastructure, and the burial chambers are now permanently submerged. In recent years, the challenge of the flooded Nuri chambers has been taken up by a team from the Qatar Sudan Archaeological Project, led by the American archaeologist Pierce Paul Kriesman, who has pioneered the use of underwater archaeological techniques to explore the submerged burial chambers. Kriesman's team has conducted diving operations inside the flooded chambers using underwater cameras, photogrammetric recording equipment, and specialized lighting systems to document the architecture and the remaining contents of chambers that have been inaccessible since Reisner's day. The work is extraordinarily difficult. The chambers are dark, cramped, and filled with sediment-laden water that reduces visibility to near zero. The divers work in conditions that are comparable to cave diving, one of the most dangerous forms of underwater exploration, and every operation requires extensive safety planning and logistical support. But the results have been remarkable. Kriesman's team has documented previously unknown architectural features in chambers that have been submerged for centuries, recovered artifacts that Reisner's pumping operations missed or could not reach in the murky water, and produced three-dimensional digital models of the subterranean complexes that have revealed construction details invisible to Reisner's above-water observation, and that have provided new evidence for the engineering techniques and the construction sequences employed by the Napatan builders. The models show chambers of considerable architectural sophistication, with vaulted ceilings, niched walls, and carefully designed drainage systems that were intended to keep the burial chambers dry, but that were eventually overwhelmed by the rising water table that has submerged them in the modern period. The discovery that has attracted the most attention and the most sustained interest from the broader international archaeological community is the team's meticulous documentation of the burial chamber of Nasta Sen, one of the last Napatan kings, whose pyramid at Nuri was one of the largest in the cemetery. The chamber, accessed through a flooded staircase that descends more than 15 meters below the surface, is a large, rectangular room with a vaulted ceiling, its walls still bearing traces of the painted decoration that once covered them. The sarcophagus of Nastasen, a massive block of stone that was too large and too heavy for the ancient tomb robbers to remove, was found still in position in the chamber, though its lid had been displaced and its contents had been looted in antiquity. The documentation of this chamber, carried out under conditions of extreme difficulty by divers working in near total darkness, is one of the most impressive feats of archaeological exploration in the recent history of Nile Valley studies. The third and largest of the Kushite royal cemeteries is Meroe itself, and it is at Meroe that the full scale and the full diversity of the Nubian pyramid tradition become apparent. The Meroe cemetery is divided into three main sections: the South Cemetery, the North Cemetery, and the West Cemetery, each containing dozens of pyramids arranged in rough rows along the desert ridge. The South Cemetery is the oldest, containing the earliest Meroitic royal pyramids dating to the 3rd century BC. The North Cemetery, which contains the largest and most elaborately decorated pyramids, was the primary royal burial ground during the peak of the Meroitic period from the 2nd century BC to the 2nd century AD. The West Cemetery contains the pyramids of lesser royals and high officials, structures that are generally smaller and less elaborately decorated than those in the royal cemeteries, but that still follow the basic pyramidal form. The North Cemetery at Meroe is the most visually spectacular of the three sections, and it is the image of the North Cemetery, with its dense cluster of steep-sided pyramids rising from the desert sand against a sky that is often cloudless and deeply blue, that has become the iconic representation of the Nubian pyramid tradition in the relatively small but growing number of publications, documentaries, and social media posts that have brought the site to international public attention in recent years. The pyramids in the North Cemetery stand close together, their bases sometimes separated by only a few meters, creating a density of monumental architecture that has no parallel anywhere else in the ancient world, and that produces a visual effect of cumulative power that is fundamentally different from the isolated grandeur of the Giza Plateau. The effect is not of individual monuments standing in splendid isolation, as at Giza, where each pyramid commands its own visual space and dominates its own section of the horizon, but of a community of monuments, a village of the dead in which each pyramid is a house, and the cemetery as a whole is a city. The visual impression is overwhelming, particularly in the late afternoon, when the low sun catches the sandstone surfaces, and the shadows of the pyramids stretch across the sand in long, dark lines that converge and overlap, and create a geometric pattern of light and shadow that seems to extend to the horizon. The chapel reliefs at Meroe constitute the largest surviving body of Meroitic religious art, and they provide the most detailed visual evidence for the funerary beliefs and the ritual practices of the Kushite elite during the Meroitic period. The chapels, built against the eastern faces of the pyramids, are small, single-room structures with decorated walls that show the deceased in the presence of the gods, receiving offerings, undergoing purification, and being judged in the afterlife. The artistic style is a distinctive blend of Egyptian, Hellenistic, and indigenous African artistic elements and traditions, with Egyptian deities rendered in poses and costumes that incorporate Meroitic features, and with compositional arrangements that follow conventions that are specific to Meroitic art, and that have no direct parallel in Egyptian artistic tradition. The god Apedamak, a lion-headed warrior deity who was unique to the Meroitic pantheon, appears frequently in the chapel reliefs, often shown in military guise with bow and arrows, symbolizing the martial aspects of Meroitic kingship that were as central to the Kushite self-image as the solar theology they had inherited from Egypt. The pattern of cultural transmission and transformation that the Nubian pyramids represent finds parallels in other civilizations across the ancient world, and these parallels illuminate the dynamics of cultural inheritance with a clarity that the Nubian case alone cannot provide. The most instructive of these parallels, and the most politically charged, involves another great African civilization whose achievements have been systematically diminished by the frameworks of Western scholarship: Great Zimbabwe. Great Zimbabwe, the massive stone enclosure complex in southeastern Africa that gives its name to the modern nation of Zimbabwe, was constructed between the 11th and 15th centuries AD by the ancestors of the Shona people, a Bantu-speaking civilization that controlled the gold trade between the interior of southern Africa and the ports of the Indian Ocean coast. The great enclosure at Zimbabwe, with its massive dry stone walls, standing up to 11 meters high and extending for more than 250 meters in circumference, is the largest ancient structure in sub-Saharan Africa south of the Sahara. It was built without mortar, using a technique of carefully fitted granite blocks that achieves its structural integrity through precision of fit rather than through the binding strength of adhesive, a technique that requires extraordinary skill and that produces walls of remarkable durability and visual elegance. The parallel with the Nubian pyramids is not architectural but historiographical. When the first European visitors encountered the ruins of Great Zimbabwe in the late 19th century, they refused to believe that black Africans had built them. The German explorer Karl Mausch, who visited the site in 1871, attributed the ruins to the Phoenicians or to the builders of the Queen of Sheba, invoking biblical and classical references to explain structures that he could not reconcile with his assumption that black Africans were incapable of monumental architecture. Cecil Rhodes, the British imperialist who founded the colony of Rhodesia and who had a political interest in denying African civilizational achievement, promoted the theory that Great Zimbabwe was built by some ancient white or Semitic race that had colonized the region in antiquity. The British archaeologist Gertrude Catton Thompson, who conducted the first systematic excavation of the site in 1929, demonstrated conclusively that Great Zimbabwe was built by the indigenous African population, and that the attribution to foreign builders was without archaeological foundation. Her findings were initially rejected by the colonial establishment, which had a political investment in the denial of African achievement, and the debate continued for decades before the scholarly consensus accepted what Catton Thompson had proven. The same dynamic, the denial or diminishment of African civilizational achievement by Western scholarly and political establishments, has shaped the reception of the Nubian pyramids in the modern world. The Kushite civilization produced more pyramids than Egypt. It maintained the pyramid tradition longer than Egypt. It controlled an empire that stretched from the Mediterranean to the heart of Africa. It produced art, architecture, and written documents of genuine sophistication and genuine originality, and it has been almost entirely excluded from the popular narrative of ancient achievement, relegated to a footnote in the story of Egypt, dismissed as a provincial imitation of a superior civilization, and ignored by a global culture that has decided, through mechanisms that are partly scholarly, partly political, and partly racial, that the pyramids belong to Egypt and that Africa built nothing of comparable significance. The comparison between Great Zimbabwe and the Nubian pyramids extends to the mechanisms of scholarly recovery. In both cases, the initial Western encounter with the monuments was shaped by racial assumptions that made it impossible for the encountering culture to acknowledge the achievements of the encountered culture on their own terms. In both cases, subsequent generations of scholars, including scholars from the African communities that descended from the builders, have challenged the dismissive framework and have established, through rigorous archaeological work, the indigenous African origins, and the genuine sophistication of the civilizations in question. And in both cases, the scholarly reassessment has been slow to penetrate the popular consciousness, where the old stereotypes and the old hierarchies continue to shape the story that the world tells about the ancient past. The Nubian pyramids challenge these stereotypes with a directness and a materiality that is difficult to evade. They are not ambiguous. They are not subject to alternative interpretation. They are pyramids. They are in Africa. They were built by Africans. They outnumber the Egyptian pyramids. They outlasted the Egyptian pyramid tradition by 6 centuries. These are facts, not interpretations. And they are facts that the popular narrative of the ancient world has been remarkably successful at suppressing or ignoring. The challenge they pose is not archaeological. The archaeology is clear. The challenge is narrative. It is the challenge of incorporating the Nubian pyramids into the story the world tells about itself, of making room for a civilization that does not fit the existing categories, and of acknowledging that the most prolific pyramid-building civilization in human history was a Black African civilization centered not on the Nile Delta and the Giza Plateau, but on the Upper Nile Valley and the Sudanese desert. The forgotten ones who built the pyramids of Meroe, the stonemasons and the quarrymen, and the artists and the priests, the kings who commissioned the monuments, and the queens who were buried beneath them, are a people whose names survive in inscriptions we cannot read and whose voices are preserved in a script we cannot translate. But their work survives. Their pyramids stand. Their achievement is visible, tangible, countable, and undeniable. 255 pyramids, give or take, standing on a desert ridge in northern Sudan, the largest concentration of pyramids anywhere on Earth, built by a civilization that the modern world has decided, through a process that has nothing to do with evidence and everything to do with assumptions, does not deserve a place in the story of human achievement. The evidence says otherwise. The pyramids say otherwise. And the pyramids, unlike the assumptions, are not going anywhere. The Meroitic kingdom's interactions with the wider ancient world extended far beyond its relationship with Egypt, and these interactions provide additional evidence for the sophistication and the reach of the Kushite civilization. The war between Meroe and Rome in the late 1st century BC, already mentioned in connection with the Candace Amanirenas, is one of the best documented episodes of African military resistance to European imperial expansion in the ancient world. The conflict began around 25 BC, when a Meroitic army attacked the Roman garrison at Syene and the nearby island of Philae, looting the towns and carrying off prisoners and booty, including the famous bronze head of Augustus. The Roman prefect of Egypt, Gaius Petronius, responded with a punitive expedition that marched south into Kushite territory, capturing the important town of Napata and destroying its temple. But the Romans did not attempt to hold the territory they had conquered. The logistics of maintaining a garrison so far from their supply base in Egypt were prohibitive, and the Meroitic resistance, led by Amanirenas and her generals, was fierce enough to discourage further penetration. A peace treaty was negotiated in 21 or 20 BC on the island of Samos, where Augustus was conducting business, and the terms were remarkably favourable to Meroe. The Romans withdrew from the territory they had occupied, reduced the tribute they had demanded, and established a frontier that respected Meroitic territorial sovereignty. The Kushites had fought Rome to a draw, a result that is almost unique in the ancient world, and that testifies to the military capacity and the diplomatic skill of the Meroitic state. The economic base of the Meroitic kingdom was more diverse and more technologically sophisticated than the popular image of ancient African economies might suggest. Meroe was one of the major iron-producing centres of the ancient world, and the massive slag heaps that surround the city, visible in satellite imagery as dark mounds dotting the landscape around the ruins, testify to an iron smelting industry of enormous scale. The British archaeologist Peter Shinney, who excavated at Meroe in the 1960s and 70s, described the site as the Birmingham of ancient Africa, a comparison that captures the industrial scale of the Meroitic iron production, even if it exaggerates its technological sophistication relative to its modern analogue. The iron industry supplied not only the domestic needs of the Meroitic kingdom, but also fueled a trade in iron tools and weapons that extended across the Sahel and into Central Africa, making Meroe a major node in the long-distance trade networks that connected the civilizations of the ancient world. The trade connections of the Meroitic kingdom extended in multiple directions. To the north, trade with Ptolemaic and Roman Egypt provided access to Mediterranean luxury goods including wine, olive oil, fine ceramics, and glass. To the east, connections through the Red Sea ports linked Meroe to the trade routes of the Indian Ocean, providing access to spices, textiles, and other commodities from India and beyond. To the south and west, trade with the African interior brought ivory, ebony, animal skins, and gold into the Meroitic economy, commodities that were then re-exported to the Mediterranean world through Egyptian intermediaries. The Meroitic kingdom was not an isolated civilization. It was a hub, a crossroads where the trade routes of the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean, and the African interior converged, creating an economic environment of extraordinary diversity and extraordinary opportunity. The wealth generated by this trade is visible in the funerary equipment recovered from the Meroitic pyramids. The gold jewelry from Amani Shaketo's pyramid, now in Munich and Berlin, is only the most spectacular example of a broader pattern of elite wealth that is documented across the Meroitic cemetery. The burials contain objects made from materials that were sourced from across the ancient world. Gold from the mines of the Eastern Desert, carnelian from India, glass from the Mediterranean, ivory from the African interior, iron from the local smelters. The diversity of these materials tells a story of economic connections that spanned continents, of a civilization that was embedded in global trade networks of extraordinary reach, and of an elite that used the products of that trade to furnish their tombs with a richness that reflected the economic reach and the cultural sophistication of the civilization that sustained them. The architectural diversity of the Meroitic pyramids also deserves attention, because it reveals a building tradition that was not static but evolving, not rigid but creative, not bound by fixed rules but responsive to changing conditions and changing priorities. The earliest Meroitic pyramids, built in the 3rd century BC, are relatively simple structures with solid sandstone cores and minimal decoration. The Middle Period pyramids, built during the peak of the Meroitic kingdom in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, are larger, more elaborately decorated, and more architecturally ambitious, with attached chapels whose relief programs show the full flowering of the distinctive Meroitic artistic style. The late period pyramids, built during the 3rd and 4th centuries AD as the kingdom was declining, are smaller, simpler, and less elaborately decorated, reflecting the reduced resources available for monumental construction during the final phase of the Meroitic state. The sequence is a visual record of the rise, the peak, and the decline of a civilization, documented in the changing scale and quality of its most characteristic monument. The math is striking. Between the first Kushite pyramid at El Kuru in the 8th century BC and the last Meroitic pyramid at Meroe in the 4th century AD, the Nubian pyramid tradition endured for approximately 1,100 years. During this period, at least 255 pyramids were built, an average of roughly one new pyramid every 4 to 5 years, sustained across more than a millennium without interruption. No other architectural tradition in the ancient world can match this record of sustained production. The Egyptian pyramid tradition lasted roughly 1,000 years and produced roughly 130 pyramids. The Nubian tradition lasted roughly the same duration and produced nearly twice as many. The numbers speak for themselves. The conservation challenges facing the Nubian pyramids are among the most acute of any major archaeological site in the world. The sandstone from which the pyramids are constructed is softer and more porous than the limestone used for the Egyptian pyramids, and it is significantly more vulnerable to erosion by wind, rain, and the abrasive action of wind-blown sand. The desert environment of northern Sudan is harsh, with extreme temperatures, low humidity, and periodic dust storms that blast the exposed surfaces of the pyramids with fine particles of quartz sand that slowly erode the carved surfaces of the chapel reliefs and the dressed faces of the pyramid casing stones. The damage inflicted by Ferlini in the 1830s removed the upper portions of many pyramids, exposing the rubble cores to the elements and accelerating the process of erosion that has been consuming the monuments since the day they were abandoned. The combination of natural erosion and human damage has placed many of the Meroitic pyramids in a condition of serious, and in some cases, critical deterioration. The site of Meroe was inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List in 2011, a designation that recognizes the outstanding universal value of the site, and that provides a framework for international cooperation in its conservation and management. The inscription was a landmark moment for the recognition of Kushite civilizational achievement because it placed the Nubian pyramids alongside the pyramids of Giza, the temples of Karnak, and the other great monuments of the Nile Valley in the global register of the world's most important cultural heritage sites. But the inscription has not, by itself, solved the conservation problems that threaten the site. The Sudanese government, which bears primary responsibility for the management and conservation of the Meroe site, has limited resources available for the kind of comprehensive conservation program that the monuments require. International assistance, while significant, has been intermittent, and the political instability that has affected Sudan in recent years has complicated the logistical and administrative arrangements that international conservation programs require. The threat of the Meroe Dam, completed in 2009 on the Nile, roughly 300 kilometers upstream from Meroe, has added a new dimension to the conservation challenge. The dam, which created a reservoir extending more than 170 kilometers upstream, flooded a significant portion of the Fourth Cataract region, submerging archaeological sites that had not been fully documented and displacing communities that had lived along the Nile for generations. The dam did not directly threaten the Meroe Cemetery, which is located well above the reservoir level, but it altered the hydrology of the region in ways that may have long-term consequences for the groundwater levels at sites throughout the Middle Nile Valley, including Nuri, where the burial chambers are already flooded, and possibly Meroe itself. The Aksumite Kingdom of Ethiopia provides an instructive parallel for understanding both the achievements of the Meroitic civilization and the dynamics of its decline. Aksum, which flourished from roughly the 1st to the 7th centuries AD, in what is now northern Ethiopia and Eritrea, was the power that ultimately contributed to the decline and fall of the Meroitic kingdom. The Aksumite king Ezna, who ruled in the 4th century AD and who is famous as the first Christian king of Aksum, conducted a military campaign into Meroitic territory that may have delivered the final blow to the already weakened Kushite state. An inscription found at Aksum describes Ezana's campaign against a people he calls the Noba and the Kasu, terms that may refer to the inhabitants of the former Meroitic kingdom and the destruction he inflicted on their towns and agricultural lands. The parallel between Aksum and Meroe is a parallel between two African civilizations, one rising and one declining, one adopting Christianity and one maintaining the ancient polytheistic traditions of the Nile Valley, one building stelae and churches and one building pyramids. The replacement of Meroe by Aksum as the dominant power in northeastern Africa was not merely a political transition. It was a cultural transition, a moment when one set of civilizational values, one set of architectural forms, one set of religious practices was replaced by another. The pyramids stopped being built. The churches began to rise. The Meroitic script fell out of use. The gaze script of Aksum took its place. The ancient gods were superseded by the Christian god, and the civilization that had maintained the pyramid tradition for 1,000 years was absorbed into a new political and cultural order that had no use for pyramids and no interest in preserving the traditions they represented. The transition from Meroe to Aksum is a reminder that civilizational traditions do not end because they run out of meaning. They end because the conditions that sustain them change, because new political powers impose new cultural frameworks, because new religions replace old ones, because the economic and social structures that funded the old traditions are dismantled or redirected by the new order. The Meroitic pyramid tradition did not die because the Kushites stopped believing in it. It died because the world around the Kushites changed in ways that made the tradition unsustainable, that redirected the resources it required, that replaced the political authorities that had commissioned it, and that imposed new cultural and religious values that had no place for the ancient form that the Kushites had maintained for so long. The modern world faces its own version of this dynamic as traditional cultural practices are displaced by global commercial culture, as local architectural traditions are replaced by standardized international styles, as indigenous languages are superseded by global languages, and as the specific, local, embodied cultural knowledge that gives each civilization its distinctive character is gradually eroded by the homogenizing forces of economic globalization. The Meroitic pyramids are a reminder that this process of cultural displacement is not new, that it has been occurring for as long as civilizations have existed, and that the traditions it displaces, however ancient and however deeply rooted, are never immune to the forces of change. The role of Sudanese archaeologists in the recovery and reinterpretation of the Kushite past deserves particular emphasis because it represents a dimension of the story that is too often overlooked in accounts that focus exclusively on the contributions of Western scholarship. Since Sudan's independence in 1956, Sudanese scholars and institutions have played an increasingly central role in the excavation, documentation, interpretation, and conservation of Kushite sites, bringing to the work a cultural perspective and a personal investment that Western scholars, however skilled and however well-intentioned, cannot fully replicate. The National Corporation for Antiquities and Museums, the Sudanese government agency responsible for archaeological heritage, has supervised excavations at sites throughout the Nile Valley and has worked to ensure that the interpretation of the Kushite past reflects the perspectives of the Sudanese people who are the direct cultural descendants of the Kush civilization. The Sudanese archaeologist Salah Mohammed Ahmed, who directed excavations at Meroitic sites for decades before his retirement, was one of the most important figures in the development of a distinctly Sudanese approach to Kushite archaeology, an approach that treated the Kushite civilization not as a provincial offshoot of Egypt, but as a major African civilization in its own right, with its own cultural logic, its own artistic vision, and its own place in the history of human achievement. Ahmed's work, and the work of the growing community of Sudanese archaeologists who have followed him, has been instrumental in shifting the scholarly narrative about Kush from one of derivation and dependence to one of creativity and achievement, and in ensuring that the Kushite past is studied not as a chapter in the history of Egypt, but as a chapter in the history of Africa and of the world. The tourism potential of the Nubian pyramids is enormous but almost entirely unrealized. The site of Meroe, with its more than 200 pyramids clustered on a desert ridge overlooking the Nile, is one of the most visually spectacular archaeological sites on Earth, comparable in visual impact to the pyramids of Giza, the temples of Angkor, and the ruins of Petra. A visitor standing on the ridge at Meroe at sunset, watching the sandstone pyramids glow in the low light, while the shadows lengthen across the desert, experiences something that has no equivalent at any other archaeological site in the world. The sight of an entire civilization's monumental output, concentrated in a single, overwhelming landscape. And yet Meroe receives only a tiny fraction of the visitors that Giza attracts, not because the site is less impressive, but because the infrastructure, the marketing, the travel connections, and the political stability needed to sustain a major tourism industry have not yet been developed in a country that has been affected by decades of conflict and economic difficulty. The development of responsible tourism at Meroe and other Kushite sites represents one of the most promising opportunities for the economic development of northern Sudan and for the broader recognition of Kushite civilizational achievement. Tourism could provide the economic resources needed for the conservation of the monuments, the employment opportunities needed to sustain the local communities, and the international attention needed to bring the Nubian pyramids to the awareness of the global public. But tourism development must be managed carefully, with attention to the conservation needs of the monuments, the rights and interests of the local communities, and the interpretive frameworks through which the sites are presented to visitors. The history of archaeological tourism is littered with examples of sites that were damaged by inappropriate development, exploited by commercial interests, and presented through narratives that distorted or diminished the achievements of the civilizations that created them. The Nubian pyramids deserve better. The question of how the Nubian pyramids should be presented to the world is not merely a question of tourism management. It is a question of narrative justice, of the right of a civilization to be represented accurately and fairly in the story that the world tells about the human past. The Kushite civilization built more pyramids than Egypt. It maintained the pyramid tradition longer than Egypt. It controlled an empire that was one of the largest in the world. It fought Rome to a draw. It produced art, architecture, writing, and political institutions of genuine sophistication. And it has been almost entirely excluded from the popular narrative of human achievement, a narrative that continues to treat the pyramid as exclusively Egyptian and Africa as a continent that produced no civilizations worthy of comparison with those of the Mediterranean and the Near East. The pyramids at Meroe stand as permanent refutation of this narrative. They are there, they are countable, they are measurable, they are real, and they are African. The story they tell is not the story that the modern world has been telling about the ancient past. It is a different story, a bigger story, a more accurate story, a story in which Africa is not the periphery but the center, in which the pyramid is not exclusively Egyptian but Nile Valley, in which the longest surviving pyramid tradition in human history belongs not to the civilization that invented the form, but to the civilization that loved it enough to carry it 1,000 kilometers south and maintain it for 1,000 years after its inventors had moved on. The pyramids stand, the story waits to be told, and the telling, when it finally comes in full, will change the way the world understands its own past. The comparative analysis of the Nubian pyramids with other traditions of monumental inheritance produces a pattern that extends beyond architecture into the broader question of how cultural traditions survive the decline of the civilizations that created them. The preservation of classical Greek philosophy by medieval Islamic scholars provides a parallel that operates in the intellectual rather than the architectural domain. When the great libraries and schools of the ancient Mediterranean world declined and closed during the late Roman and early medieval periods, the philosophical and scientific texts of Aristotle, Plato, Euclid, Ptolemy, and Galen were preserved, translated, and commented upon by scholars working in the Islamic world, in Baghdad, in Cordoba, in Cairo, in centers of learning that maintained and developed a tradition of rational inquiry that Europe had temporarily abandoned. When the texts returned to Europe during the 12th and 13th centuries, translated from Arabic into Latin by scholars working in Toledo and Sicily, they fueled the intellectual revolution that would eventually produce the Renaissance and the scientific revolution. The Islamic scholars were to Greek philosophy what the Kushites were to the Egyptian pyramid, inheritors who preserved, adapted, and transmitted a tradition that the originating culture had ceased to maintain. The preservation of Buddhist architectural traditions in Southeast Asia provides another parallel that operates at the intersection of architecture and religion. The stupa, the dome-shaped Buddhist reliquary monument that was developed in India during the centuries following the death of the Buddha, was adopted by the civilizations of Southeast Asia and was elaborated into forms of extraordinary complexity and beauty that had no direct precedent in Indian architecture. The temples of Borobudur in Java and Angkor in Cambodia are among the largest and most elaborate Buddhist and Hindu monuments in the world, and they represent the creative transformation of Indian religious architecture by cultures that adopted the underlying religious and philosophical framework while developing their own distinctive architectural expression. Like the Kushites, the Southeast Asian builders were not imitators. They were transformers, creative agents who took an inherited tradition and made it their own. The pattern repeats across civilizations and across centuries. Japanese preservation of Chinese cultural forms, Byzantine preservation of Roman legal and administrative traditions, Irish monastic preservation of classical Latin learning during the European Dark Ages. In every case, a peripheral or successor culture preserves a tradition that the originating culture has abandoned or transformed beyond recognition, And in every case, the preserving culture transforms what it preserves, producing something that is recognizably related to the original but genuinely new. The Nubian pyramids are the most physically imposing example of this pattern in the ancient world, and they are the example that has been most completely ignored by the modern world's narrative of cultural achievement. The irony is that the very qualities that make the Nubian pyramids so significant, their African location, their black builders, their status as inheritors rather than originators of the pyramid form, are the qualities that have been used to diminish them. A European or Mediterranean civilization that had built 255 pyramids over a period of 1,000 years would be celebrated in every textbook, depicted in every documentary, and visited by millions of tourists every year. An African civilization that accomplished the same thing is almost unknown. The disparity is not a matter of archaeological evidence. The evidence is clear, abundant, and accessible. The disparity is a matter of narrative, of the stories that cultures tell about themselves and about others, and of the assumptions, conscious and unconscious, that determine which achievements are celebrated and which are ignored. The Nubian pyramids do not need the world's permission to be significant. They are significant. They are the product of one of the most enduring and most productive building traditions in the history of human civilization, a tradition that outlasted its origin, outproduced its model, and endured for a millennium in a landscape that most of the modern world has never heard of. They stand in the Sudanese desert, 255 of them, steep and narrow and golden in the afternoon light, and they will stand for centuries to come, whether the world acknowledges them or not. But the acknowledgement matters. It matters because the story the world tells about its past shapes the story it tells about its present, and a story that excludes the achievements of an entire continent is a story that is not merely incomplete but actively harmful, a story that distorts the past, diminishes the present, and impoverishes the future. There is a moment, late at night, when the facts and the comparisons and the scholarly debates fall away, and the emotional reality of what has been described becomes personal. It stops being about sandstone and steeper angles and Meroitic scripts. It starts being about the feeling of standing in a landscape filled with the monuments of a civilization that the world has decided not to remember. A civilization whose achievements are tangible, countable, visible, and undeniable, and that has nevertheless been excluded from the story of human achievement with a thoroughness that borders on the systematic. The deeper truth of the Nubian pyramids is not about archaeology. It is about memory. It is about the mechanisms through which human civilizations decide what to remember and what to forget, what to celebrate and what to ignore, which achievements are incorporated into the collective narrative of human progress, and which are silently excluded. And the truth that the Nubian pyramids reveal about these mechanisms is deeply uncomfortable, because it demonstrates that the selection is not neutral, that the narrative is not natural, that the story the world tells about the ancient past is not an objective reflection of what actually happened, but a constructed narrative shaped by the assumptions, the prejudices, and the political interests of the people who constructed it. Let that sink in. 255 pyramids, a 1,000-year tradition, an empire that stretched from the Mediterranean to the heart of Africa, a military force that fought Rome to a draw, a system of writing that has been only partially deciphered, a series of powerful queens who ruled in their own right centuries before any comparable concentration of female political authority existed in the Mediterranean or the Near East. All of this is documented. All of this is established. All of this is available to anyone who opens a book on Kushite archaeology or who makes the journey to the Sudanese desert and looks at the evidence with their own eyes. And almost none of it has penetrated the popular consciousness of the modern world. The Nubian pyramids are not hidden. They are not lost. They are not buried. They are ignored. The grief of this story is not the grief of a civilization that was destroyed. The Kushite civilization was not destroyed by conquest or catastrophe, in the way that the Aztec civilization was destroyed by the Spanish or the Minoan civilization was destroyed by volcanic eruption. The Kushite civilization declined gradually, absorbed into the successor kingdoms of post-Meroitic Nubia, and eventually into the Islamic civilization that transformed northeastern Africa in the medieval period. The grief is not about the civilization's end. The grief is about its erasure from memory, the systematic exclusion of its achievements from the narrative of human history that the modern world has constructed and that is taught in schools, depicted in documentaries, displayed in museums, and embedded in the popular imagination of billions of people across the globe. This is not science fiction. This is the documented reality of how the modern world's narrative of the ancient past has been constructed. The narrative was built during the 19th and early 20th centuries, when European scholars and explorers were mapping the ancient world and deciding which civilizations would be included in the canon of human achievement and which would be relegated to the margins. The decisions they made were shaped by the racial assumptions of their time, assumptions that placed European and Mediterranean civilizations at the center of the narrative and African and Asian civilizations at the periphery. The Kushite civilization, as a black African civilization, was placed firmly at the periphery, its achievements attributed to Egyptian influence, its originality denied, its place in the hierarchy of human civilizations fixed at a level that ensured it would never compete for attention with the civilizations of the Mediterranean. The American scholar W.E.B. Du Bois, writing in the early 20th century, recognized the political dimensions of this erasure with a clarity that has not been surpassed. Du Bois argued that the exclusion of Africa from the narrative of human civilization was not an innocent oversight, but a deliberate strategy of cultural domination, a means of justifying the colonial exploitation of Africa by denying that Africans had ever produced anything worth preserving. The denial of African civilizational achievement was, in Du Bois's analysis, a form of intellectual violence that was as damaging in its long-term effects as the physical violence of the slave trade and colonial conquest. The Nubian pyramids are evidence that Du Bois was right. They are tangible, measurable, undeniable evidence of African civilizational achievement on a scale that rivals anything produced by the Mediterranean world, and their exclusion from the popular narrative is evidence that the intellectual frameworks Du Bois criticized are still operating, still shaping the story the world tells, still determining which achievements are remembered and which are forgotten. Let that sink in. The mechanisms that Du Bois identified more than a century ago are still active, still shaping the curriculum of schools and universities, still determining which civilizations receive full chapters in textbooks and which receive a paragraph or a footnote or nothing at all. The narrative has been partially corrected by the work of subsequent scholars, by the growing influence of African and African diaspora voices in the academy, by the increasing visibility of Kushite archaeological discoveries in the digital media, and by a broader cultural shift toward more inclusive understandings of the human past. But the correction has been incomplete, painfully slow, and unevenly distributed, and the popular understanding of the ancient world remains dominated by a framework that was designed, consciously or unconsciously, to exclude precisely the kind of achievement that the Nubian pyramids represent. The school curricula of most countries in the world still teach the pyramids as Egyptian and only Egyptian. The documentaries still focus on Giza. The museums still display Kushite artifacts under Egyptian labels. The narrative framework that was built in the 19th century is still standing. Its foundations cracked, but its superstructure intact, and it will take more than scholarly publications and academic conferences to bring it down. It will take a change in the stories that ordinary people tell each other about the past, a change in the images that appear when the word pyramid is typed into a search engine, a change in the assumptions that children absorb before they are old enough to question them. It will take, in short, a revolution in popular consciousness that matches the revolution that has already occurred in scholarly understanding. The grief of the Nubian pyramids is not the grief of physical destruction, though the damage inflicted by Ferlini and by centuries of erosion is real and permanent and irreversible. The grief is the grief of invisibility, of being present but unseen, of standing in the open desert for 2,000 years and being passed over by a world that has decided, for reasons that have nothing to do with evidence, that your achievements do not count. The Egyptian pyramids have been seen. They have been photographed, painted, written about, filmed, analysed, argued over, and incorporated into the visual vocabulary of human civilization in a way that makes them among the most recognised structures on the planet. The Nubian pyramids have not been seen. They have been photographed by a handful of specialists and adventurous travellers. They have been written about in scholarly journals that reach an audience of hundreds. They have been filmed by a small number of documentary producers who recognised their visual power and their narrative significance. But they have not been incorporated into the visual vocabulary of civilization. They have not entered the popular imagination. They remain, despite more than a century of archaeological documentation, essentially invisible to the global public. The invisibility is not accidental. It is structural. It is embedded in the educational systems, the media landscapes, the museum cultures, and the publishing industries of the modern world, all of which operate according to priorities and assumptions that were established during a period of European colonial dominance, and that have not been fully revised to reflect the post-colonial understanding of human history. The revision is happening. It is happening in universities, where courses on African civilizations are being developed and taught. It is happening in museums, where exhibitions of Kushite art and archaeology are being mounted with increasing frequency and increasing ambition. It is happening on the internet, where photographs of the Meroe pyramids circulate among communities of people who are passionate about African history and who are working, through sharing and advocacy and digital storytelling, to bring the Nubian pyramids to the attention of a global audience. But the revision is slow, it is incomplete, and the pyramids standing in the Sudanese desert in their hundreds are still waiting. The recovery of the Kushite past is not merely an academic exercise. It is a moral imperative, a necessary correction to a narrative that has been distorted by racial prejudice and colonial ideology for more than a century. The pyramids at Meroe do not need to be discovered. They need to be seen. They need to be acknowledged. They need to be incorporated into the story that the world tells about the ancient past, not as a footnote or an addendum or an exotic curiosity, but as a central chapter in the history of human civilizational achievement. The Kushites built more pyramids than the Egyptians. They maintained the tradition longer. They produced a civilization of genuine sophistication, genuine originality, and genuine power. These are facts. They deserve to be part of the story, and their exclusion from the story is not a neutral omission. It is a choice that has consequences for how the world understands Africa, for how Africans understand themselves, and for how all of us understand the full scope of what human beings are capable of achieving. The modern museum system provides a final illustration of the mechanisms through which the Nubian pyramids have been marginalized. The gold jewelry from Amani-Shaketo's pyramid, removed by Ferlini in 1834, is displayed in the Egyptian museums of Munich and Berlin, not in the National Museum of Khartoum, not in the community from which it was taken, not in the country whose civilization produced it. The bronze head of Augustus, captured by the Candace Amanirenas and buried beneath a temple at Meroe, is displayed in the British Museum in London, a trophy of imperial conflict that was taken from one empire by another and then taken from both by a third. The most important portable artifacts of the Kushite civilization are scattered across European museums, removed from their archaeological context, separated from the monuments they were associated with, and displayed in galleries that present them as specimens of ancient art, rather than as the products of a living civilization, with its own history, its own values, and its own claims on the objects it created. The repatriation of cultural artifacts is one of the most contentious issues in contemporary museum practice, and the Kushite case illustrates the complexity of the debate with particular clarity. The artifacts in European museums are beautifully conserved, expertly displayed, and accessible to large numbers of visitors who would never have the opportunity to see them if they were returned to Sudan. But their presence in European collections reinforces the narrative framework that has marginalized the Kushite civilization, because it places Kushite objects in an Egyptian context in galleries labeled Egyptian antiquities rather than Kushite art, and it presents them to audiences that have been conditioned by the existing narrative to see them as provincial Egyptian artifacts rather than as the products of an independent and sophisticated African civilization. The museum label matters, the gallery designation matters, the narrative framework within which the objects are presented matters, and the framework in most major Western museums is still a framework that treats the Kushite civilization as an appendage of Egypt rather than as a civilization in its own right. The question of how the Nubian pyramids should be understood as copies or as creations, as derivatives or as transformations, as evidence of dependence or as evidence of achievement, is not merely an academic question. It is a question about the values that the modern world brings to its encounter with the past, about the assumptions it makes, about which peoples are capable of genuine creativity, and which peoples are merely capable of imitation, about the frameworks it uses to organize its understanding of human history, and about the consequences of those frameworks for the people whose histories are organized by them. The Nubian pyramids demand that these questions be asked. They demand that the answers be honest, and they demand that the narrative be changed. The desert wind blows across the ridge at Meroe. The pyramid has cast long shadows across the sand. The silence is not the silence of a place that has been forgotten. It is the silence of a place that is waiting to be heard, waiting with the patience of sandstone and the persistence of a tradition that endured for 1,000 years, for the world to turn its attention south, to look beyond the familiar skyline of Giza, and to see what the Kushites built in the desert and what the desert has preserved. We assume that what we build will outlast us. The ruins suggest otherwise. Every monument is a bet against time, and time has never lost. But the Nubian pyramids add a dimension to this observation that the Egyptian pyramids do not. The Egyptian pyramids have been remembered. Their bet against time has been honoured by human memory, even as their physical substance has been eroded by human quarrying. The Nubian pyramids have been physically preserved, but culturally erased. Their stone endures, while their story has been suppressed. The bet against time was won in the material sense and lost in the narrative sense, and the loss in the narrative sense is, in some ways, more devastating than any loss in the material sense could be, because a monument that is remembered but physically destroyed, like the labyrinth of Hawara, retains a presence in human consciousness that a monument that is physically intact but culturally invisible, like the pyramids of Meroe, does not. The philosopher Paul Ricoeur wrote about what he called the hermeneutics of suspicion, the practice of reading texts and cultural artifacts, not only for what they say but for what they conceal, not only for the stories they tell, but for the stories they suppress. The popular narrative of the ancient world is a text that rewards this kind of suspicious reading because what it suppresses is as significant as what it says. It says that the pyramids were built in Egypt. It suppresses the fact that more pyramids were built in Sudan. It says that the pyramid tradition lasted 1,000 years. It suppresses the fact that it lasted 2,000 years, 1,000 in Egypt and 1,000 more in Nubia. It says that the pyramid is an expression of Egyptian civilization. It suppresses the fact that the most enduring expression of the pyramid tradition was produced by an African civilization that the narrative has decided not to acknowledge. The suppression is not active or intentional in most cases. It operates through omission rather than commission, through the simple failure to mention the Nubian pyramids when discussing the pyramid tradition, through the habit of treating Egypt as the whole story rather than as the first chapter of a longer story that continues south, up the Nile, into the desert, into Africa. The correction of this omission requires not merely the addition of new information to the existing narrative, but the restructuring of the narrative itself. The story of the pyramid is not the story of Egypt. It is the story of the Nile Valley, a story that begins at Saqqara and continues through Giza, through Abusir, through Darsha, through Hawara, and then south across the border into Sudan, to El Kuru and Nuri and Meroe, where the tradition found its most prolific and its most enduring expression. The full story of the pyramid is not complete without the Nubian chapter, and the Nubian chapter is not a footnote or an epilogue. It is the longest chapter in the book. The modern recovery of the Kushite past has been accelerated in recent years by developments in technology that have made the Nubian pyramids more accessible to a global audience than at any previous time. Satellite imagery, drone photography, three-dimensional scanning technology, and social media platforms have brought images of the Meroe pyramids to millions of people who would never have encountered them through traditional scholarly channels. The visual impact of the Meroe cemetery, with its dense forest of steep-sided sandstone pyramids catching the Sudanese sun, is powerful enough to cut through the narrative frameworks that have suppressed the Nubian pyramids for more than a century. A photograph of the Meroe cemetery does not need a caption to make its point. The pyramids speak for themselves. They say, "We are here, we are real, we are many, and we have been waiting for you to see us." The question of whether the world is ready to see the Nubian pyramids, to truly see them, to incorporate them into the story it tells about the human past, is the question that the next generation of scholars, educators, filmmakers, and cultural commentators will have to answer. The archaeological evidence is clear. The scholarly literature is extensive and growing. The monuments are standing, visible, accessible, and spectacularly photogenic. What is missing is the narrative framework, the story that connects the Nubian pyramids to the broader story of human civilization in a way that the popular consciousness can grasp and retain. The pyramids at Meroe are waiting for their story to be told. They have been waiting for a very long time, and the sand that drifts across the cemetery, covering and uncovering the bases of the pyramids with each passing season, is a reminder that time is patient, that the desert is patient, and that the truth, buried or ignored or suppressed, has a way of emerging eventually from the sand that covers it. The Nubian pyramids force a reckoning with the most fundamental question that any study of the ancient past must eventually confront. Who decides which civilizations matter? The answer, as the history of Kushite studies demonstrates with painful clarity, is that the decision is made by the people who write the textbooks, who curate the museum exhibitions, who produce the documentaries, who design the school curricula, and who control the publishing houses and the media platforms through which the narrative of the past is transmitted to the present. These people are not neutral. They operate within cultural frameworks that shape their perceptions, their priorities, and their judgments. The framework that has dominated the study of the ancient world for the past 2 centuries has been a framework designed by European scholars for European audiences, a framework that places the Mediterranean and the Near East at the center, and that treats Africa, Asia, and the Americas as peripheral zones whose achievements are measured against the Mediterranean standard and found wanting. The Nubian pyramids do not fit this framework. They complicate it, they challenge it, they reveal its limitations and its biases, and they demand that the framework be expanded, revised, or replaced by something more comprehensive, something more inclusive, something more faithful to the actual diversity and the actual complexity of the human past. The expansion will not be easy. Frameworks are resistant to change. Narratives have momentum. The story the world tells about the ancient past has been told the same way for so long that changing it requires not merely adding new information, but rewriting the structure of the story itself. But the rewriting is necessary. It is overdue. And the pyramids at Meroe, standing in the Sudanese desert in their hundreds, steep and golden and patient, are the most eloquent argument for its necessity that the ancient world has produced. The craft knowledge that built the Meroitic pyramids, the specific skills of stone cutting, block laying, relief carving, and surface finishing that were practiced by the Kushite builders for 1,000 years, is as lost as the craft knowledge that built the Egyptian pyramids. The stonemasons of Meroe possessed a form of expertise that was specific to their materials, their tools, their techniques, and their aesthetic tradition, an expertise that was transmitted through apprenticeship and practice over generations, and that vanished when the last generation of practitioners died without training successors. The sandstone surfaces of the Meroitic pyramids bear the marks of this lost expertise, the chisel marks, the tool traces, the patterns of surface finishing that record the movements of individual craftsmen whose names we will never know and whose skills we cannot reconstruct. Every pyramid at Meroe is a monument to this anonymous expertise, a physical record of knowledge that was embodied in the hands and the eyes and the reflexes of the workers who built it, and that died with them, leaving nothing behind but the stone they shaped and the silence that followed their passing. Step back now from the sandstone and the Meroitic script and the chapel reliefs and the scholarly debates, and look at the full arc of what has been described, because the story of the Nubian pyramids is not in the end a story about a single civilization in a single region in a single period of history. It is a story about the nature of cultural memory, about who controls the narrative of the human past, and about the consequences of excluding entire civilizations from that narrative. We live in a world that is increasingly aware of the distortions embedded in its inherited narratives, increasingly conscious of the biases that have shaped the stories it tells about itself. The conversations about representation, about inclusion, about the decolonization of knowledge and culture that are occurring in universities, museums, media organizations, and educational institutions around the world are conversations that bear directly on the Nubian pyramids and on the broader question of which civilizations are included in the canon of human achievement and which are excluded. These conversations are not abstract. They have concrete implications for how curricula are designed, how museum exhibitions are curated, how documentaries are produced, and how the billions of dollars that flow through the global heritage industry are allocated. The Nubian pyramids have been on the losing side of these allocation decisions for more than a century. The funding for Kushite archaeology has been a fraction of the funding for Egyptian archaeology. The scholarly publications on the Kushite civilization fill a small shelf in a library that devotes an entire floor to Egypt. The media coverage of Kushite discoveries is measured in column inches, while the media coverage of Egyptian discoveries is measured in television hours and blockbuster exhibitions. The disparity is not a reflection of the relative importance of the two civilizations. It is a reflection of the narrative framework that determines which civilizations are considered important and which are not. The exclusion of the Kushite civilization from the popular understanding of the ancient world is not an isolated case. It is part of a broader pattern of exclusion that has affected civilizations across Africa, across Asia, across the indigenous Americas, and across the Pacific, civilizations whose achievements have been diminished, denied, or ignored by the narrative frameworks inherited from the colonial era. The digital age has the potential to disrupt this pattern in ways that were impossible in the era of print publishing and broadcast media. A single viral photograph of the Meroe pyramids can reach more people in a day than a decade of scholarly publications. A well-produced documentary about the Black Pharaohs can introduce the Kushite civilization to an audience of millions who would never encounter it through traditional educational channels. The democratization of media production and distribution has created opportunities for narrative correction that did not exist a generation ago, and the growing global interest in African history, driven by diaspora communities, by African scholars and cultural organizations, and by a broader cultural movement toward more inclusive understandings of the human past, has created an audience that is eager for the stories the traditional narrative has suppressed. But technology alone cannot correct a narrative distortion that is embedded in the institutional structures of education, scholarship, and cultural production. A search for pyramids still returns images of Giza. A search for ancient civilizations still returns results dominated by Egypt, Greece, and Rome. Changing the algorithm requires changing the data. Changing the data requires changing the narrative. And changing the narrative requires the kind of sustained, institutional, politically supported effort that has not yet been fully mounted on behalf of the Kushite civilizations or the dozens of other civilizations whose achievements have been marginalized by the inherited frameworks of Western scholarship. The correction of these distortions is not merely a matter of academic accuracy. It is a matter of justice, of the right of every civilization to be represented in the human story on terms that reflect its actual achievements, rather than the prejudices of the people who wrote the first drafts of that story. The Kushites built 255 pyramids. They maintained a civilization for more than 1,000 years. They controlled an empire that fought Rome to a negotiated peace. They developed a writing system that remains only partially deciphered. They produced art of genuine beauty and genuine originality. They created a political system that gave women a degree of institutional power that was unmatched in the ancient Mediterranean. These are achievements that deserve recognition, that demand recognition, and that have been denied recognition for reasons that have nothing to do with evidence and everything to do with the frameworks through which evidence is interpreted and presented to the world. The implications extend beyond the specific case of the Kushite civilization to the broader question of how the modern world constructs and maintains its understanding of the past. Every narrative is a selection. Every history is an editing of the totality of the past into a sequence of events that the narrator considers significant and that the audience is expected to find meaningful. The selection criteria are never neutral. They reflect the values, the interests, and the assumptions of the selecting culture. The modern world's narrative of the ancient past was selected by European scholars in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and the selection criteria reflected the values, the interests, and the racial assumptions of European culture during the period of colonial expansion. The Kushite civilization did not meet these criteria. It was excluded, and the exclusion has persisted through intellectual inertia and institutional habit, long after the racial assumptions that produced it have been repudiated by the scholarly community. The digital age offers both a challenge and an opportunity for the rectification of this narrative injustice. The challenge is that the inherited narrative, with its European centre and its African periphery, is deeply embedded in the digital infrastructure of the modern world, in the algorithms that determine which content is surfaced and which is suppressed, in the databases that structure scholarly access to information, and in the search engines that shape public understanding of virtually every topic. The opportunity is that the same digital infrastructure can be used to disseminate the corrective narrative, to bring images of the Meroe pyramids to audiences that would never encounter them through traditional channels, to share the work of Kushite scholars with global audiences, and to create the conditions for a popular awareness of the Nubian pyramids that could transform the way the world understands the ancient past. The Nubian pyramids also challenged the modern world to reconsider its understanding of the relationship between originality and inheritance, between creation and preservation, between the civilization that invents a form and the civilization that sustains it. The Western intellectual tradition has historically privileged originality over preservation, treating the inventor as more significant than the inheritor, the creator as more important than the custodian. But the Nubian pyramids suggest that this hierarchy is misleading. The Kushites did not merely preserve the pyramid form, they transformed it, adapted it, and sustained it through 1,000 years of changing political, economic, and cultural conditions. Their contribution was not less significant than the Egyptian contribution. It was different in kind, a contribution of endurance and adaptation rather than of invention, of cultural transmission rather than of cultural creation, of sustained commitment rather than of initial inspiration. And this kind of contribution, the contribution of the custodian who maintains and adapts and transmits a tradition across centuries, is as essential to the survival of human cultural heritage as the contribution of the inventor who creates the tradition in the first place. The implications for the modern world are direct and practical. In an era of rapid cultural change, of globalization and homogenization, and the progressive displacement of local traditions by global commercial culture, the skills of cultural custodianship, the ability to preserve, adapt, and transmit inherited traditions across changing conditions, may be the most valuable skills any civilization can possess. The Kushites possessed these skills in abundance. They maintained the pyramid tradition for 1,000 years, adapting it to their own cultural context, modifying its physical expression while preserving its theological essence, and producing a body of monumental architecture that exceeds in quantity and rivals in quality the achievements of the civilization from which they inherited the form. The lesson of this achievement for a modern world that is struggling to maintain its own cultural traditions in the face of accelerating change is that preservation is not a passive act. It is a creative act. It requires the same commitment, the same resources, the same institutional dedication, and the same cultural will that creation requires. And the civilizations that are best at preservation may ultimately be the civilizations whose cultural legacies endure the longest. The Kushite example suggests that the modern world's obsession with novelty, with innovation, with the production of the new at the expense of the maintenance of the old, may be a civilizational vulnerability rather than a civilizational strength. A society that values only creation and that neglects preservation, that rewards only the inventor and that ignores the custodian, that celebrates only the breakthrough and that dismisses the sustained maintenance of inherited traditions, is a society that is consuming its cultural capital without replenishing it, that is spending its inheritance without investing in its legacy. The Kushites understood something that the modern world has largely forgotten, that the maintenance of a tradition is itself a form of creation, that the sustained commitment to a cultural form across centuries of changing conditions requires as much ingenuity, as much dedication, and as much institutional will as the initial invention of that form. The Kushite pyramid builders were not mere copyists. They were creative custodians who adapted an inherited form to new circumstances, who solved new engineering problems with new solutions, who produced new artistic expressions within an inherited framework, and who sustained a tradition that their predecessors had abandoned. Their achievement deserves to be recognized as what it was. Not imitation, but innovation of a different kind. The innovation of persistence, the innovation of adaptation, the innovation of sustained commitment to a cultural vision that transcended the political and economic vicissitudes of more than a millennium of continuous practice. The Nubian pyramids have endured. They have endured through the decline of the Meroitic kingdom, through the rise and fall of the post-Meroitic successor states, through the coming of Christianity, through the coming of Islam, through the centuries of Ottoman and Egyptian and British colonial domination, through Sudan's independence and its subsequent political turbulence, through Fellini's treasure hunting and Reisner's excavation, and the slow erosion of wind and sand that has been consuming the sandstone surfaces since the day the last pyramid was sealed. They have endured because they were built well, because the sandstone of the Meroe region is hard and durable, because the desert climate is dry and preservation friendly, and because the site's remote location has protected it from the kind of intensive stone robbing that consumed the casings of the Egyptian pyramids. But they have also endured because the tradition that built them was itself enduring, a tradition of sustained commitment to a single architectural form that lasted for a millennium, and that produced more monuments than any comparable tradition in the ancient world. The pyramids at Meroe do not need the world's permission to be significant. They are significant. They have been significant for more than 2,000 years. They will be significant for as long as they stand, which, given the durability of sandstone and the dryness of the Sudanese climate, will be a very long time indeed. The question is not whether the pyramids are worthy of attention. The question is whether the world is worthy of the pyramids, whether a civilization that claims to value knowledge, diversity, and the full scope of human achievement can afford to continue ignoring the most prolific pyramid-building tradition in human history, simply because it does not fit the narrative that it inherited from an era of colonial prejudice and racial hierarchy. The sun sets over the Meroe cemetery, and the pyramids catch the last light of the day in a way that transforms the landscape from an archaeological site into something that feels more like a vision, more like a dream remembered from a previous life, more like the memory of a world that existed once, and that has been waiting, in the silence of the Sudanese desert, for the world to remember that it was real. The transformation happens quickly. In the space of 20 minutes, the pyramids change from golden to amber to a deep, burnt sienna that makes the sandstone look as though it is smouldering, as though the stone itself is on fire, with a heat that has been stored since the days when the builders laid the blocks and the priests performed the funerary rituals, and the queens and kings of Kush were carried in procession to the pyramids that would house them for eternity. The pyramids glow. The sandstone surfaces, warmed by the day's heat and illuminated by the low, horizontal light of the setting sun, radiate a golden luminosity that seems to come from within the stone rather than from the surface, as though the pyramids are generating their own light, as though the energy that the Kushite builders invested in their construction has been stored in the fabric of the monuments for 2,000 years and is being released, slowly and steadily, as the temperature of the stone equalizes with the cooling air of the desert evening. The shadows lengthen. The truncated summits of the pyramids that Ferlini decapitated cast ragged shadows across the sand, shadows that record, in the negative space of the evening light, the damage that one man's greed inflicted on a civilization's legacy. The intact pyramids, the ones that Ferlini's workers could not reach or chose not to bother with, cast clean, pointed shadows that stretched toward the east, toward the Nile, toward the cultivated land that sustained the civilization that built them. The question this documentary began with was, who built the pyramids of Nubia and why they have been forgotten? The answer is clear. The pyramids were built by the kings and queens of Kush, a black African civilization that conquered Egypt, ruled it as pharaohs for 75 years, and then carried the pyramid tradition back to their homeland, where they maintained it for more than 600 years after Egypt stopped building pyramids. They have been forgotten because the frameworks through which the modern world understands the ancient past were designed by people who could not or would not acknowledge that black Africans had built anything of genuine civilizational significance, and because the narrative inertia of those frameworks has persisted through institutional habit and educational convention and media repetition, long after the assumptions that created them have been recognized as false by virtually every scholar who has actually studied the evidence. But the pyramids have not forgotten. They remember in the only language that stone knows, the language of endurance, of persistence, of physical presence that outlasts the narratives that try to contain it and the frameworks that try to diminish it. They stand in the Sudanese desert, more than 200 of them, steep and narrow and golden in the evening light, the most concentrated landscape of pyramids anywhere on Earth, and they will stand for centuries to come, indifferent to the stories the world tells about them, indifferent to the narratives that include them or exclude them, indifferent to the scholarly debates and the museum labels and the search engine algorithms that determine whether they are seen or unseen, remembered or forgotten, celebrated or ignored. They stand as evidence that the pyramid tradition did not belong to Egypt alone, that it was a Nile Valley tradition, a tradition that was shared, adopted, adapted, transformed, and sustained by multiple civilizations over a span of more than 3,000 years, from the step pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara to the last royal pyramid at Meroe in the 4th century AD. They stand as evidence that a great African civilization built more pyramids than any civilization in the Mediterranean world, and maintained the tradition longer than any civilization in the Mediterranean world. And they stand as a rebuke to a narrative of the ancient past that has found room for every pyramid north of the First Cataract, and no room at all for the 255 pyramids that stand south of it, in a country that most people in the world could not locate on a map, built by a civilization that most people in the world have never heard of, in a desert that most people in the world will never visit. The direct answer to the title's implicit question, what are the Black Pharaohs' tombs, and why do they matter, is this. The Black Pharaohs' tombs are the pyramids of Nubia, the most numerous pyramids on Earth, built by the kings and queens of the Kushite civilization over a period of more than 1,000 years, and they matter because they represent the longest continuous commitment to a single monumental form in the history of human architecture, because they demonstrate that the pyramid tradition was not exclusively Egyptian, but was shared across the civilizations of the Nile Valley, and because their near-total exclusion from the popular narrative of the ancient world reveals the mechanisms through which that narrative has been constructed and the biases that have shaped it. But the deeper answer is that they matter because they are beautiful, because they are moving, because the sight of 200 pyramids rising from the Sudanese desert in the evening light is one of the most extraordinary experiences that the ancient world still has to offer, and because the civilization that built them deserves to be remembered not as a footnote in the history of Egypt, but as a central chapter in the history of Africa and of the world. The Kushites loved the pyramid. They loved it more faithfully and more enduringly than the Egyptians who invented it. They carried it south, adapted it to their own vision, and maintained it for centuries after its creators had moved on to other forms. That love, that commitment, that thousand-year fidelity to a form they had inherited and made their own is itself an achievement that deserves a place in the story of what human beings are capable of building and sustaining and maintaining across the vast and indifferent stretches of time. The wind moves across the ridge. The sand drifts around the bases of the pyramids. The chapel reliefs, carved in sandstone that is slowly being eroded by the desert wind, show kings and queens in the presence of gods whose names we can pronounce, but whose meanings we cannot read, performing rituals whose purposes we can guess at, but cannot confirm, in a language that has been silenced for 1600 years, and that waits, with the patience of the desert and the persistence of stone, for the scholar who will finally unlock its secrets and give voice to a civilization that has been silent for far too long. There is a final image that deserves to be held in the mind as this story ends, an image that captures the full weight and the full meaning of what the Nubian pyramids represent. It is the image of the cemetery at Meroe at the moment when the sun has set and the afterglow illuminates the western sky, when the pyramids are silhouetted against the fading light as a jagged, irregular skyline of dark triangular shapes, like a city seen from a distance, like the skyline of a metropolis that exists only at this hour, and in this light, a city of the dead that is more populated and more architecturally dense than most cities of the living. In this light, the truncated pyramids and the intact pyramids are indistinguishable. Fellini's damage is invisible. The erosion is invisible. The neglect is invisible. What is visible is the scale, the sheer overwhelming number of monuments that the Kushite civilization produced in this single cemetery, the cumulative evidence of a tradition that endured for a millennium, and that left behind a landscape of monuments so dense and so numerous that it has no parallel anywhere on the planet. The pyramids of Nubia are the Black Pharaohs' tombs. They are the most numerous pyramids on Earth. They are the longest surviving pyramid tradition in human history. They are standing in the Sudanese desert, 255 of them, steep and golden and patient, and they are waiting for the world to look south, to see what stands there, and to understand at last that the story of the pyramid is not the story of one civilization in one country on one stretch of the Nile, but the story of a tradition that was born in Egypt, raised to its greatest height at Giza, and then carried south up the river into the heart of Africa, where it found its most faithful and its most enduring home.